There are moments in Scripture when the greatest crisis is not that evil exists. It is that evil seems to be winning while God remains silent. That is where the story of Habakkuk begins, not in a palace, not on a battlefield, not with a spectacular miracle. It begins with a prophet looking at his own nation and asking a question believers have repeated for centuries. How long can violence continue before God intervenes? How long can injustice become normal before judgment comes? How long can people who know the law ignore it, manipulate it, and use power against the weak? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, what are we supposed to believe about God when He appears to see everything and yet does not immediately stop it? Habakkuk is one of the shortest books in the Old Testament, only 3 chapters long. But within those chapters is one of the most intense conversations between a prophet and God anywhere in Scripture. Habakkuk does not simply announce judgment to other people. He wrestles with God. He questions what he sees. He receives an answer. Then he discovers that the answer creates an even greater problem, and by the end of the book, something extraordinary has happened. The violence has not yet disappeared. The threatening empire has not yet vanished. The future has not suddenly become safe. Yet the man who began by asking why God was not acting will eventually declare that even if the fields produce nothing, even if the flocks disappear, even if the visible foundations of life collapse, he will still rejoice in the Lord. The journey between those 2 moments is the story of Habakkuk. It is a journey from anguish to waiting, from waiting to revelation, from revelation to fear, and from fear to a faith strong enough to stand even when circumstances do not change. But to understand why Habakkuk was so troubled, we have to enter the world he was watching fall apart. The book gives us very little biographical information about the prophet himself. We are not told who his father was. We are not given the name of his hometown. Scripture does not describe his childhood, his family, or the moment he first received his prophetic calling. Even the exact date of his ministry is not stated. But the political situation described in the book strongly points toward a dangerous period in Judah's history, when the old balance of power in the ancient Near East was collapsing and a terrifying new empire was rising. Assyria, the empire that had dominated the region for generations, was weakening. Decades earlier, Assyria had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and deported much of its population. Judah had survived, but survival had come beneath the shadow of enormous foreign powers. Now, Assyria itself was beginning to fall. For a smaller kingdom like Judah, that might have sounded like good news. It was not, because another power was rising from Mesopotamia, Babylon, the Chaldeans, a people whose armies would soon transform the political landscape of the ancient world. Their rise would eventually place Judah, Jerusalem, the Temple, and the Davidic monarchy in mortal danger. But Habakkuk's first complaint is not about Babylon. His first complaint is about Judah. That matters. Before the prophet fears the enemy outside the nation, he is grieving over corruption inside it. He looks around and sees violence. He sees wrongdoing. He sees conflict multiplying. He sees disputes that do not lead to justice. He sees the law losing its power to restrain evil. He sees justice distorted because wicked people are able to surround and overpower the righteous. This is not merely the frustration of someone who believes society could be managed more efficiently. For Israel, justice was connected to covenant faithfulness. The law was not supposed to function only as a collection of religious rituals. It shaped how the people treated neighbors, foreigners, workers, families, the poor, the vulnerable, and one another. Israel had been called to live differently because Israel belonged to God. So when Habakkuk says that the law appears paralyzed and justice comes out twisted, He is describing something deeper than political dysfunction. The covenant community itself is becoming disordered. The people possess God's instruction, but possession is not the same as obedience. The institutions of justice still exist, but institutions mean little when those with power bend them. Religious identity may remain visible while righteousness disappears beneath it. And Habakkuk cannot understand why God allows this condition to continue. His opening words are not detached theological speculation. They sound like the cry of someone who has been watching for a long time. He has prayed. He has waited. He has seen the same patterns continue, and finally the question breaks into the open. How long must I cry for help? That phrase reveals something essential about Habakkuk. He is not asking because he does not believe God exists. He is asking because he does. If Habakkuk believed there were no God, injustice would simply be one more brutal fact of existence. But Habakkuk believes God is righteous. He believes God hears. He believes God judges evil. He believes God gave his law to Israel. And that is exactly why the silence is so difficult. Faith creates the question. Habakkuk knows what he believes about God. Then he looks at what is happening around him, and the two appear impossible to reconcile. This is one of the reasons his book has remained so powerful. Scripture does not hide the tension. It does not present genuine faith as the absence of difficult questions. Habakkuk takes the question directly to God. He does not pretend that violence is acceptable. He does not rename injustice as blessing. He does not force himself to call darkness light simply because he is a prophet. He brings the contradiction into the presence of God. That is the beginning of his transformation. Not certainty, honesty. The book opens by identifying what follows as the burden or oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. A burden is an appropriate word, because what he sees weighs on him. Imagine the prophet observing disputes in streets and gates where justice should have been administered. Families hearing the law of Moses read, while powerful people ignored its demands. Religious ceremonies continuing while violence and exploitation spread beneath the surface. The outward structures of covenant life remain, but something inside the nation is breaking. This was not a problem unique to Habakkuk. The prophets repeatedly confronted the same dangerous illusion that a people could maintain sacred institutions while abandoning justice, mercy, and obedience. A temple could stand while hearts rebelled. Sacrifices could continue while corruption spread. A nation could still speak God's name while living as though his commands no longer mattered. And history had already shown where that road could lead. The northern kingdom of Israel had fallen more than a century earlier. Prophets had warned it. Political leaders had ignored them. Assyria had eventually arrived. Samaria had fallen. Now Judah still possessed Jerusalem. Judah still possessed the temple. Judah still possessed the dynasty associated with David. But possessing sacred history did not make the nation immune to accountability. This is the atmosphere surrounding Habakkuk's cry. Something is wrong, and he believes God sees it, so why does God seem to tolerate it? There is an important difference between divine patience and divine indifference, but from inside the waiting, they can look painfully similar. That is the position Habakkuk occupies. He is standing inside the delay. He cannot yet see the full movement of history. He sees only the immediate moment. Evil continues. Justice is distorted, and heaven has not yet responded in the way he expects. For Habakkuk, the problem is not whether God has power. The problem is why God has not used that power already. Why allow injustice enough time to become entrenched? Why allow violent people to grow confident? Why allow the righteous to feel surrounded? Why give a law if the wicked can apparently neutralize it? His complaint is almost uncomfortable in its directness, and yet God does not rebuke him for asking. Instead, God answers. That answer changes everything about the scale of the story. Habakkuk has been looking at Judah. God tells him to look among the nations. Habakkuk has been measuring events by what he can see happening around him. God tells him that something is already moving beyond his field of vision. The prophet thinks heaven has been inactive. God tells him that a work is underway, one so astonishing that Habakkuk would struggle to believe it even if someone explained it to him. This is the first reversal in the book. God has not been doing nothing. Habakkuk's problem is about to become the opposite. God is doing something. And Habakkuk will wish the answer had been easier to understand. There is a lesson here, but we should not rush toward it. It would be easy to turn the scene into a comforting slogan, God is always working behind the scenes. Habakkuk will eventually learn to trust that truth. But at this moment, the work happening behind the scenes is terrifying. God's hidden activity is not the immediate rescue of Judah. It is the raising of an empire. The Chaldeans are coming. Babylon is emerging as the instrument through which judgment will move across the region. Habakkuk had asked God to confront violence. The answer is an army known for violence. He had asked God to correct injustice. The answer involves a nation that will conquer lands not its own. He had asked God to save his society from corruption. The answer threatens the survival of the society itself. This is where the book of Habakkuk becomes far more difficult than a simple lesson about patience. If God's response had been immediate reform, Habakkuk's problem might have ended here. If a righteous king had appeared and cleansed the nation, perhaps the prophet could have said, "Now I understand." If corrupt officials had been removed and justice restored, the story would have moved neatly from complaint to solution. But that is not what Habakkuk hears. God describes the Chaldeans as fierce and impetuous. They march across territories that do not belong to them. Their reputation inspires dread. Their military power is not portrayed as gentle correction. It is overwhelming. Their horses are described through images of frightening speed and predatory force. Their cavalry advances from far away. Their soldiers sweep forward. They gather captives. They mock kings. They laugh at fortified cities. Human defenses that appear permanent become temporary obstacles before them. The picture is deliberate. Habakkuk is being told that the political world he knows is about to be shaken by a force Judah cannot control. A new imperial power is rising, and its confidence is enormous. These are not rescuers. They do not come because they love justice. They do not invade because they want Judah to become faithful to the covenant. They conquer because conquest is what empires do. Their strength becomes their standard. Their success becomes their justification. Their power becomes almost religious. The very description of Babylon contains the seed of another judgment. After sweeping through nations, the Chaldeans become guilty because they make their own strength their god. That detail will become critical later. For now, Habakkuk is left staring at a terrifying contradiction. God will use Babylon, but Babylon is not righteous. God's answer to the prophet's first question has opened a second question that is much harder. Habakkuk wanted to know why God tolerated evil in Judah. Now he must ask why God would use a nation capable of even greater violence to judge it. And this question cuts to the heart of the book. Can a holy God use an unholy empire without approving its evil? Can Babylon serve a purpose in God's judgment and still be held accountable for its pride, cruelty, and bloodshed? If God rules history, what does that mean when history is carried forward by violent kingdoms? And what happens when the answer to prayer is more frightening than the problem that produced the prayer? Habakkuk had begun by demanding action. Now action is coming. The silence is over. But relief does not follow. A shadow is moving from the east. Cities will hear of it. Kings will fear it. Walls will not guarantee safety. Judah's internal corruption has not disappeared, but now a greater danger is approaching from beyond its borders. The prophet has received his answer, and instead of ending his struggle, it forces him deeper into it. Because Habakkuk now understands something he did not understand when he first cried, "How long?" God is not absent from history. He is acting within it. The problem is that his action does not fit the prophet's expectations. The Chaldeans are rising, and Habakkuk must now face the question that will drive the next stage of his journey. How can the God who is too pure to delight in evil use an empire whose hands are stained with it? The answer Habakkuk had demanded was now standing before him in the form of an approaching empire. The Chaldeans were rising, and to understand why God's answer disturbed the prophet so deeply, we have to understand what that name represented in Habakkuk's world. Babylon was not yet simply the ruined city remembered by later generations. It was becoming the center of a new imperial order. For decades, the ancient Near East had lived under the enormous shadow of Assyria. Assyrian kings had built one of the most feared military systems of the ancient world. Their armies crossed borders, destroyed cities, deported populations, and turned smaller kingdoms into tributary states. The northern kingdom of Israel had already experienced what Assyrian power could do. Samaria had fallen. Its people had been scattered. Judah had survived, but survival did not mean independence from the struggles of great empires. Then the balance began to change. Assyria weakened, rebellion spread. Babylon rose under new leadership. The Medes pressed Assyria from another direction, and in 612 BC, Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, fell. One empire was dying, another was emerging from its collapse. For the smaller nations caught between Mesopotamia and Egypt, this was not simply a distant geopolitical event. The roads armies traveled crossed their lands. The taxes great kings demanded came from their harvests. The wars of empires could determine whether their cities survived. Judah stood directly inside that dangerous world. And Habakkuk was told that the Chaldeans would become the force through which judgment advanced. God's description is unsettling from the beginning. He does not introduce Babylon as noble reformers. He calls attention to their ruthlessness. They are bitter. They are hasty. They sweep across the earth. They seize places that do not belong to them. Their sense of justice does not come from God's covenant law. They establish their own authority. In other words, Babylon does not arrive asking what is right. Babylon arrives with enough power to decide what happens. That is exactly the kind of nation Habakkuk would find difficult to understand as an instrument in the hands of God. The prophet had complained that justice was being distorted inside Judah. Now he hears about an empire whose political order is built on domination. The irony is almost unbearable. Habakkuk has prayed about violence. God answers by announcing soldiers. He has complained that the wicked surround the righteous. God answers with a nation that will surround entire cities. He has mourned twisted justice. God answers with conquerors whose authority comes from themselves. The contradiction is deliberate. It forces Habakkuk beyond the simple idea that divine judgment must always arrive through obviously righteous human agents. Scripture repeatedly shows that God can direct the course of nations without declaring those nations morally innocent. That distinction will become essential to the book. Babylon can be used. Babylon can also be judged. But Habakkuk has not yet reached the second half of that truth. At first he hears only that they are coming. The imagery grows more terrifying. Their horses are described as swifter than leopards and fiercer than wolves at dusk. The comparison would have communicated speed and predatory hunger. These are not animals wandering without purpose. They are hunters. The cavalry comes from far away. It appears like an eagle or a bird of prey rushing toward food. Before defenders can fully react, the attack is already upon them. Habakkuk's generation lived before modern communications, modern vehicles, and modern warning systems. A rumor that an army had crossed a distant river could become news that nearby towns had already fallen. Messengers traveled, refugees moved, stories spread from city to city. The names of conquered places became warnings to those still standing. And Babylon was building that kind of reputation. Its armies would become one of the defining forces of the era. The old centers of power were shifting. The Chaldeans were not approaching as one more regional rival. They were moving toward imperial dominance. Habakkuk describes them gathering captives like sand. The image strips conquest of its political language. To an empire, prisoners could become numbers. To the conquered, every captive had a name: someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's father, someone's mother, a soldier, a farmer, a craftsman, a priest, a child carried away from the only city he had known. Empire measures victory by territory. Prophets force us to remember the people inside the territory. This is why Habakkuk's problem cannot be reduced to abstract philosophy. His question about evil has consequences made of flesh and blood. He knows what invasion means. He knows that if judgment comes through an army, judgment will be experienced by ordinary people as fear, loss, displacement, siege, hunger, death, and exile. And the description continues. The Chaldeans mock kings. Rulers who once appeared powerful become objects of contempt. Fortresses that required years to construct are treated as problems that can be solved. Ancient cities depended on walls. Walls represented security. They separated citizens from invading soldiers. They protected storehouses, homes, temples, administrative centers, and royal authority. A strong, fortified city could resist an enemy long enough for political conditions to change. But Habakkuk's vision strips away the psychological comfort of walls. The Babylonian advance makes fortifications look temporary. They heap up earth, they attack, they take the city. Human beings build structures and quietly begin believing those structures cannot fall. History repeatedly proves otherwise. A wall can be impressive and still be temporary. A dynasty can look permanent and still end. An empire can terrify the world and still disappear. A temple can stand in magnificent stone, while the people who worship around it move farther from the God whose name it bears. Judah's danger was that visible continuity could be mistaken for divine approval. Jerusalem was still standing. The Davidic dynasty still existed, the temple still functioned, but Habakkuk was being shown that sacred history did not make rebellion harmless. The question was no longer whether Judah possessed a religious inheritance. The question was whether the people living within that inheritance would remain faithful to the God who had given it. And now an army was being raised in a world where Judah could not control the outcome. The political background makes the warning even heavier. Egypt still sought influence in the region. Assyria's remains struggled for survival. Babylon's power expanded. The smaller kingdoms between those great powers could attempt alliances, diplomacy, tribute, rebellion, and military calculation. But Habakkuk is being told that underneath the visible strategies of kings, another level of history exists. Human rulers make real choices. Armies move for political reasons. Empires seek wealth, territory, security, and glory. Yet Scripture presents God as sovereign even over movements that human beings understand only in political terms. That does not make every imperial decision righteous. It does not turn conquest into moral goodness. It means that human evil cannot escape the boundaries of divine judgment forever. And that truth creates a problem that Habakkuk is about to press with extraordinary boldness. Because if God is sovereign over Babylon's rise, then God must also remain righteous while Babylon acts unrighteously. How? The prophet is not going to accept an easy answer. Before he asks the question, however, the first divine response ends with one of the most revealing statements about Babylon itself. After the army sweeps forward like the wind, it becomes guilty. Why? Because its own strength becomes its god. This is the spiritual center of Babylonian arrogance in Habakkuk's description. Power is no longer merely something Babylon possesses. Power becomes something Babylon worships. Victory begins to provide its own moral justification. We won, therefore we were right. We conquered, therefore we deserved to rule. We are strong, therefore no one can judge us. That logic is ancient. It is also one of the recurring illusions of human power. Success can become a counterfeit theology. An empire wins enough battles and begins believing history belongs to it. A king receives enough praise and begins believing he answers to no one. A society accumulates enough wealth and begins believing prosperity proves righteousness. A military becomes powerful enough and begins believing force itself determines truth. Habakkuk exposes the lie before Babylon has even reached the height of its dominance. The empire will appear irresistible, but irresistible is not the same as eternal. Its strength may be real, its conclusions about that strength are false. Babylon sees its victories and worships itself. God sees Babylon's victories and still sees guilt. That difference will shape everything that follows. The Chaldeans think conquest proves they are supreme. Habakkuk will discover that their conquest is temporary and accountable. They may become an instrument of judgment without becoming the final judge. They may overthrow kings without escaping the king above every kingdom. They may gather nations into their net, but they cannot gather God into it. At this point, however, Habakkuk has only fragments of that larger picture, and he is disturbed. His original complaint concerned wicked people within Judah. He saw the righteous surrounded. He saw the law paralyzed. He saw justice twisted. He wanted God to intervene. Now imagine what he has just heard. The answer is not merely, I see the problem. It is not merely, justice will come. The answer is effectively, look beyond your borders. Watch what is happening among the nations. A force is rising that you would hardly believe. That force will move with terrifying speed. Kings will not stop it. Fortresses will not stop it. And the nation at the center of this movement is arrogant enough to treat its own power as divine. How could Habakkuk simply nod and walk away from? The answer threatens to intensify the very moral problem that made him cry out in the first place. If violence in Judah was intolerable, why would Babylonian violence be the remedy? If wicked people in Judah deserve judgment, did the Chaldeans not deserve judgment too? If God cared about justice, how could he allow conquerors to swallow nations? This is where the prophet begins to move from his first complaint toward his second. And his second complaint is more dangerous. The first question was, why are you allowing evil? The second will become, why are you allowing greater evil to triumph over people less wicked than those committing it? Habakkuk now turns away from the battlefield imagery and back toward the character of God. That is important. He does not begin his next argument with politics. He begins with theology. He remembers who God is. Everlasting, holy, his rock, the God with whom Israel stands in covenant relationship. Habakkuk is trying to hold two realities together. First, God is holy. Second, Babylon is brutal. If both are true, there must be more to the story than Habakkuk currently understands. But he does not resolve the tension by pretending it is easy. He brings it back to God. That may be one of the most important features of the entire book. Habakkuk's faith does not prevent him from protesting. His protest does not cause him to abandon faith. He argues from what he knows about God's character. He essentially says, "Because you are holy, I do not understand what you are doing. Because you are eternal, I know Babylon cannot have the final word. Because you are my rock, I must believe judgment has limits even when I cannot see them." This is not unbelief walking away. It is faith refusing to stop the conversation. And soon, Habakkuk's language becomes even more vivid. He will compare humanity to fish in the sea, creatures without a ruler, vulnerable, caught by hooks, dragged into nets, collected by a conqueror who rejoices over the catch. The image is horrifying because it reveals how empire can see human beings, not as neighbors, not as image bearers, not as families, as resources, as trophies, as captives, as proof of military greatness. Babylon throws out the net. Nations fall into it, and then Babylon celebrates the net itself. The tool of conquest becomes an object of devotion. That is what happens when strength becomes God. People cease asking whether the thing they can do is something they should do. Ability replaces morality. Success replaces righteousness. Victory replaces truth. And Habakkuk cannot accept that such a system could continue forever under the rule of a holy God. The prophet has therefore arrived at the deepest crisis of the first half of his book. He asked God to speak. God spoke. He asked God to act. God revealed that action had already begun. He wanted assurance that evil would be confronted. God announced Babylon. The answer has not destroyed Habakkuk's faith, but it has shattered his expectations. Sometimes the most difficult moment is not when heaven is silent. Sometimes it is when heaven answers, and the answer refuses to fit the shape we prepared for it. Habakkuk now knows that Judah will not continue unchanged. Judgment is moving. The Chaldeans are coming. But another truth is beginning to emerge beside the terror. The nation God uses is not beyond God's examination. Babylon's arrogance has already been named. Its guilt has already been exposed. Its power has limits it cannot yet see. And Habakkuk is about to ask the question that must be answered before his faith can move forward. If the God of Israel is truly holy, how long will he allow Babylon to devour nations without mercy? The prophet has finished asking why God does nothing. Now he must ask something far more difficult. What does it mean when God acts in a way he cannot understand? Habakkuk had received an answer, but he had not received peace. The prophet had begun by looking at Judah and asking why God allowed violence, injustice, and corruption to continue. Now he had been told that judgment was coming through Babylon. And suddenly the problem became larger, much larger, because Babylon was not a righteous nation arriving to correct an unrighteous one. The Chaldeans were ruthless conquerors. They moved across borders. They swallowed kingdoms. They trusted their weapons. They glorified their victories. They treated human beings as captives to be gathered and territories as possessions to be taken. So Habakkuk does something remarkable. He questions God again. Not because he has abandoned faith, but because the answer he has received seems impossible to reconcile with the God he knows. And this time, Habakkuk begins not with the condition of Judah, but with the character of God. Are you not from everlasting? The question reaches backward, beyond Babylon, beyond Judah, beyond Assyria, beyond every empire that had ever risen or fallen. Human kingdoms are temporary. God is not. Kings appear, kings disappear. Dynasties begin, dynasties collapse. Armies conquer cities that once seemed unconquerable. Then those armies themselves vanish into history. But Habakkuk addresses the one who existed before all of them, the everlasting God, his Holy One. This is where Habakkuk's second complaint becomes more than protest. It becomes an act of theological reasoning. The prophet does not evaluate God by Babylon. He evaluates Babylon by what he knows about God. And what he knows creates tension. God is eternal. God is holy. God is his rock. Therefore, Babylon cannot be ultimate. Babylon may be terrifying. Babylon may be advancing. Babylon may be stronger than Judah. But Babylon cannot occupy the place that belongs to God. Habakkuk appears to recognize that the Chaldeans have been appointed for judgment. He understands at least part of what God has said. Judah is not innocent. The corruption he complained about was real. The law had been paralyzed. Justice had been distorted. Violence had filled the land. Habakkuk is not suddenly pretending that his people deserve no correction. That would contradict his original prayer. His question is not, why would you judge Judah? His deeper question is, why would you judge Judah through them? There is a difference. Habakkuk can understand that his nation needs correction. What he cannot understand is the apparent moral imbalance between the instrument of judgment and the people being judged. He looks at Babylon, then he looks toward God, and he says in effect, you are too pure to approve evil. You cannot delight in wrongdoing, so how can you look upon those who act treacherously? Why remain silent when the wicked swallow those more righteous than themselves? Notice the wording. Habakkuk does not call Judah completely righteous. He says Babylon is swallowing those more righteous than Babylon. That is a comparative statement, not a declaration of Judah's innocence. This distinction matters. The prophet still remembers Judah's sins, but Babylon's brutality appears to exceed them. The theological problem now becomes sharp. If justice is real, how can a more violent power be allowed to defeat a less violent one? If God judges wrongdoing, why does the instrument of judgment appear even more guilty? If Babylon succeeds, will that success not make evil look victorious? These are not comfortable questions. Habakkuk does not make them comfortable. The book refuses to solve the problem by denying any side of it. Judah is guilty, Babylon is guilty, God is holy, history is moving. All four truths must somehow remain together, and Habakkuk cannot yet see how. He reaches for an image. Humanity, he says, has become like fish in the sea, like creatures crawling without a ruler. The picture is strange at first. Then it becomes disturbing. Imagine a sea filled with living creatures moving without defense against a fisherman above them. The fisherman lowers a hook. A fish is taken. He drags a net through the water. More are caught. He gathers them together. He pulls them from the world where they lived freely. Habakkuk says this is what the conqueror does to nations. Babylon hooks people. Babylon drags them away. Babylon gathers them into nets. And then Babylon rejoices. The comparison turns imperial conquest into something painfully simple. The conqueror stands above. The conquered are trapped below. The powerful choose. The powerless are chosen. A king may speak of expanding borders. A military commander may speak of strategic victory. An empire may celebrate new provinces. But for the people caught inside that expansion, the experience is different. A town loses its sons. A family loses its home. A farmer loses fields cultivated for generations. A child watches soldiers enter a city whose walls were supposed to protect her. A priest sees sacred places stripped. A captive begins a journey toward a foreign land without knowing whether he will ever return. Habakkuk's imagery makes conquest personal. And then he adds another detail. The Babylonian does not simply use the net. He honors it. He sacrifices to his net. He burns incense to his dragnet. Why? Because through these instruments his portion is rich and his food plentiful. The image may be poetic, but its meaning is unmistakable. Babylon worships the means of its own success. Military force, political power, weapons, strategy, conquest. Whatever gives the empire victory becomes worthy of trust. The conqueror looks at his success and concludes that the source of his power must be supreme. This is the same spiritual disease God had already exposed when describing the Chaldeans as those whose strength became their God. Now Habakkuk takes that idea and expands it. The empire worships the net because the net works. That is one of the oldest forms of idolatry. Not merely bowing before a carved figure, but trusting something created because it produces results. If wealth works, wealth becomes a god. If military power works, military power becomes a god. If political control works, political control becomes a god. If intelligence works, intelligence becomes a god. If influence works, influence becomes a god. Human beings can begin worshiping the instrument that gives them what they want, and success makes the illusion difficult to challenge. Babylon's victories appear to confirm Babylon's worldview. Every defeated city seems to say, "Your strength is enough." Every captive seems to say, "Your methods work." Every conquered king seems to say, "No one can stop you." But Habakkuk understands something Babylon does not. Success is not the same as innocence. Power is not the same as righteousness. Victory is not the same as divine approval. And temporary dominance is not the same as final authority. Still, the prophet needs more than a principle. He needs to know whether Babylon will be allowed to continue. So he asks the question with which his second complaint reaches its climax. Will the conqueror keep emptying his net of? Will he continue destroying nations without mercy? In other words, does Babylon have an end? That question carries enormous weight. Habakkuk has moved from wondering why God tolerates Judah's evil to wondering whether God will place a limit on Babylon's evil. The first complaint asked about delay. The second asks about control. How far will the empire be permitted to go? How long will conquest continue? What happens when the instrument of judgment becomes drunk on its own success? What happens when the sword begins believing it controls the hand? The answer is not given immediately, and that matters. Habakkuk has spoken, now he waits. The prophet changes posture. He says he will take his stand at his watchpost. He will station himself on the tower. He will look out to see what God will say to him. The image slows the entire book. Until now there has been motion, violence in Judah, empires rising, horses racing, armies advancing, nations being caught like fish. Suddenly the prophet becomes still. He stands, he watches, he waits. The Watchtower was a place of attention. A watchman looked into the distance. He searched the horizon. His responsibility was to see what others had not yet seen. A distant movement. Dust. Travelers. An approaching army. Danger. News. The watchman lived between what was visible now and what was coming next. That is exactly where Habakkuk now stands spiritually. He cannot see the resolution. He knows only that the present situation cannot be the whole story. God is holy. Babylon is guilty. Judgment is coming. But Habakkuk does not yet know how these truths will meet. So he climbs the tower of waiting. This may be the quietest moment in the book. It is also one of the most important. Habakkuk does not demand an answer and then leave before it comes. He prepares to receive correction. He even wonders how he will answer when he is reproved. That detail reveals humility beneath his boldness. The prophet is confident enough to ask hard questions, but he is not arrogant enough to assume every conclusion he has drawn must be correct. He believes there is something he does not see, so he waits for God to show it to him. That combination is rare. Honesty without arrogance, questioning without abandonment, conviction without the assumption of complete understanding. Habakkuk has spoken forcefully. Now he becomes teachable. He does not know how God will respond. He does not know how long the waiting will last. He only knows that the contradiction cannot be resolved by pretending it does not exist. The righteous God and the ruthless empire remain before him. He will watch until another word comes. And this is where the central spiritual movement of Habakkuk begins to change. At first the prophet wanted immediate intervention. Now he must learn to wait for a vision whose fulfillment may not be immediate at all. That is a harder kind of faith. It is one thing to trust God when the answer arrives quickly. It is another to receive a promise that includes delay. Human beings often tolerate uncertainty when they know it will end soon. A night is easier when sunrise is only minutes away. A journey is easier when the destination is visible. A crisis is easier when the solution has already begun to appear. Habakkuk does not yet have any of those comforts. Judah's corruption has not vanished. Babylon's armies have not become righteous. The geopolitical danger remains. Nothing visible has changed while he stands on the Watchtower. And yet his position has changed. He is no longer merely crying out from inside the confusion. He is actively waiting for God to speak into it. There is a difference between silence and waiting. Silence feels empty. Waiting assumes someone may answer. Habakkuk waits because he believes God has not finished speaking, and God has not. The response that follows will contain one of the most influential sentences in the entire Old Testament. A sentence short enough to remember, deep enough to echo centuries later through Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. But before that sentence comes an instruction. Write the vision, make it clear, make it plain enough that its message can be carried forward. Because what God is about to reveal is not meant only for the emotion of one prophet standing on one tower. It concerns the destiny of the arrogant, the survival of the righteous, the limits of empire, the certainty of judgment, and the problem of time. The vision, God will say, has an appointed moment. It may appear slow. Wait for it. It will not ultimately fail. That answer will not tell Habakkuk that Babylon is harmless. It will not tell him that his fears are imaginary. It will not deny the coming devastation. Instead, it will change the scale by which he measures what he sees. Babylon is looking at the present and concluding, "We are strong. Therefore we will always be strong." Habakkuk is about to be taught to look beyond the present. The empire sees its victories. God sees its end. The empire sees nations beneath its feet. God sees the moral weight of everything it has done. The empire believes appetite can expand forever. God knows pride contains the seed of its own fall. But Habakkuk must live in the space between the promise and the fulfillment. That is where the famous declaration will come. The proud person is not upright. His life is distorted by self-exaltation. But the righteous person will live by faith, by faithfulness, by steadfast trust in the Word of God, even when the visible world appears to contradict it. That truth has not yet been explained to Habakkuk, for now he is still standing on the tower. Perhaps below him, the life of Judah continues as before. People trade, officials judge disputes, priests carry out their duties, families prepare meals, rumors move along roads. Somewhere beyond Judah, armies gather. Babylon continues rising. Nothing on the horizon tells Habakkuk exactly how this will end. But he refuses to leave his post. The prophet who began the book with "How long?" is now learning the discipline that his question requires. Watch, wait, listen. The answer to evil will not be found by pretending evil is small. The answer to Babylon will not be found by pretending Babylon is righteous. And the answer to divine delay will not be found by assuming delay means absence. Habakkuk has brought the full weight of his complaint before God. He has asked why the wicked seem able to devour those less wicked than themselves. He has asked whether the conqueror will keep emptying his net forever. Now the question hangs over the Watchtower. Will power have the final word? Will Babylon's success justify Babylon? Will the violence simply continue because no one is strong enough to stop them? Or is there an appointed end that only God can already see? Habakkuk waits, and when the answer comes, God will not begin by explaining every detail of Babylonian history. He will give the prophet something more demanding: a vision, a promise, and a choice between two ways of living, one built on pride, the other built on faith. Habakkuk stood at the watchpost with a question no human empire could answer. Would Babylon continue forever? Would violence simply produce more violence until the strongest power on earth became the closest thing history had to a god? Would the conqueror keep emptying his net, swallowing nations, gathering wealth, and calling victory proof that he was right? Or was there an end that Habakkuk could not yet see? The prophet waited, and then the Lord answered. The response does not begin with a timetable of battles. God does not immediately name the year Babylon will fall. He does not give Habakkuk every political detail that will unfold between the rise of the Chaldeans and their eventual judgment. Instead, he gives him a vision, and the first command is simple: write it down, make it plain, preserve it. The answer Habakkuk is about to receive must not remain an unrecorded, private experience between one troubled prophet and God. It is to be written because the meaning of the vision reaches beyond the emotion of the moment. Habakkuk is living inside one chapter of history. The vision points beyond it. Babylon appears to be rising without limit. God says Babylon exists within an appointed time. That distinction changes everything. From the ground, an empire can look permanent. From eternity, it is temporary. Habakkuk sees an army gaining momentum. God sees both its rise and its end. Habakkuk sees what is happening now. God speaks of what will certainly happen later. And the prophet is about to learn that one of the deepest tests of faith is not whether we believe God can act. It is whether we trust His word when the fulfillment is not immediate. The vision, God says, awaits an appointed time. It moves toward its conclusion. It does not lie. And then comes the instruction that confronts the impatience at the heart of Habakkuk's struggle. Though it seems to delay, wait for it. It will surely come. The words are both comforting and difficult. Comforting because evil does not have unlimited time. Difficult because Habakkuk must still wait. The prophet had begun the book by asking, "How long now?" God's answer does not erase the existence of how long. It tells Habakkuk how to live inside it. Wait. Not because nothing is happening. Not because Babylon has become righteous. Not because Judah's suffering is insignificant. Wait because the appointed end belongs to God and not to Babylon. This is one of the central movements in the book. Habakkuk wanted immediate moral clarity. God gives him certainty without immediacy. The judgment is certain. The timing requires trust. Those two things are not the same. Human beings often want certainty and speed together. If justice is real, we want to see it now. If a promise is true, we want evidence immediately. If God is acting, we want the action to become visible within the span of our own patience. Habakkuk is being taught that divine certainty does not always operate according to human urgency. This does not make his urgency wrong. Violence should trouble him. Corruption should trouble him. The suffering caused by Babylon should trouble him. God never tells Habakkuk to become emotionally indifferent to evil. What changes is the prophet's assumption that delayed judgment means absent judgment. The delay has an appointed boundary. Babylon cannot see it. Habakkuk cannot calculate it. But God has already declared it. And then the vision moves from the question of time to the question of character. Two kinds of people are placed in contrast. On one side stands the proud. His soul is not upright within him. On the other stands the righteous. And then comes the sentence that will echo far beyond Habakkuk's own generation. The righteous shall live by his faith. Or as the idea can also communicate in this context, the righteous person will live by faithful trust, by steadfast dependence upon God. This sentence is famous, but if we remove it from Habakkuk's crisis, we can miss its force. The prophet is not sitting in a quiet classroom discussing faith as an abstract concept. An empire is rising. Judgment is approaching. The future of Judah is unstable. Habakkuk has just been told to wait for something he cannot yet see. And right there between the certainty of God's word and the uncertainty of history, the righteous person is told how to live. By faith. That means Habakkuk's central question is beginning to change. At first he asked, why does God allow evil? Then, why would God use Babylon? Now the question becomes personal. How should a righteous person live while these questions remain unresolved? The answer is not by controlling history. Habakkuk cannot do that. Not by becoming stronger than Babylon. Judah cannot do that by its own power. Not by pretending judgment will never come. God has already said it will. Not by concluding that Babylon's present success means Babylon owns the future. It does not. The righteous live by faith. This is not passive resignation. It is not pretending everything is fine. Faith in Habakkuk does not mean closing your eyes to the approaching army. The prophet has been painfully aware of reality from the first verse. Faith means refusing to interpret the whole story by the visible power of the present moment. Babylon says, look at our horses, look at our armies, look at our captives, look at the kings we have defeated. Look at the walls we have broken. Look at our wealth. Look at our victories. Habakkuk is being taught to look somewhere else. At the word of the one who existed before Babylon, at the character of the Holy One. At the appointed end Babylon cannot escape. At a promise whose truth does not depend on whether its fulfillment is visible today. This contrast between pride and faith becomes the moral center of the book. The proud person expands outward. The faithful person stands firm. The proud person needs more. The faithful person learns to trust. The proud person treats success as proof of self-sufficiency. The faithful person knows life itself depends on God. The proud person believes power creates security. The faithful person understands that every human structure remains temporary. Babylon is the great picture of the first way. Habakkuk is being invited into the second. And that invitation comes before his circumstances improve. That matters. If Habakkuk were told to trust only after Babylon had fallen, the lesson would be easy. If he were asked to rejoice only after the threat disappeared, that would require gratitude, but not the same kind of faith. Habakkuk must learn trust while Babylon is still Babylon, while the threat is still real, while Judah's future is still frightening, while the vision still waits. Faith does not begin at the end of uncertainty. It is formed inside it. The text then continues describing the proud conqueror. His appetite is restless. He is never satisfied. He enlarges his desire like the grave. Like death, he keeps taking nation after nation, people after people, territory after territory. Enough never becomes enough. This is another reason Babylon cannot create peace through conquest. Its hunger has no natural stopping point. If security depends on possessing more land, then more land must always be taken. If greatness depends on defeating more rivals, another rival must always be found. If identity depends on supremacy, anyone outside your control becomes a threat. The empire is powerful, but its power cannot cure its appetite. That is one of the ironies of pride. It promises sufficiency, then makes sufficiency impossible. The more Babylon possesses, the more Babylon must possess. The more it conquers, the more its identity depends on conquest. The more nations fear it, the more it must maintain the fear. What appears externally as strength hides an internal slavery. The empire cannot stop wanting. Habakkuk's earlier image of the fishing net returns in another form. The conqueror catches nations, but in another sense, the conqueror is caught by his own appetite. Power demands more power. Wealth demands more wealth. Victory demands another victory. The proud soul is not upright because it cannot remain properly ordered before God. It stretches beyond its proper place. It refuses limits. It wants what belongs to others. It looks at success and concludes, I answer to no one. But the entire vision contradicts that claim. Babylon does answer to someone. The empire does have a limit. The conqueror will be measured. The nations Babylon gathered will not remain silent forever. God now begins turning the voice of history against the empire. The peoples who have been plundered will become the voices announcing Babylon's judgment. The one who mocked kings will himself become the subject of mockery. The one who gathered nations will hear those nations pronounce words of condemnation. The hunter will discover that the story did not end with the hunt. This is the beginning of the great reversal that will dominate the next section of Habakkuk. For now, however, we should remain with the contrast God has given the prophet. Pride, faith. These are not merely two private attitudes. They produce two radically different ways of living. Pride says, my strength will preserve me. Faith says, God is my life. Pride says, what I possess defines my security. Faith says, my security cannot finally rest in what can be taken away. Pride says, the present proves I am untouchable. Faith says, the present is not the entire story. Pride sees delay and assumes judgment will never come. Faith sees delay and continues waiting for the appointed time. This is what Habakkuk must become, not a man who has solved every mystery, a man who can remain faithful before every mystery is solved. That transformation is already beginning. When Habakkuk first cried out, his attention was fixed almost entirely on the contradiction before him. Violence here, silence above. Then God widened his vision. There were nations beyond Judah. There was Babylon rising. Then Habakkuk's crisis grew. God widened the vision again. There is an appointed end beyond Babylon. Each time Habakkuk thinks he is looking at the whole problem, God reveals that his field of vision is too small. First, Habakkuk sees corruption in Judah. Then he sees international judgment. Then he sees the future judgment of Babylon itself. The prophet lives moment by moment. God speaks across generations. This does not mean Habakkuk's questions are foolish. They are the questions of someone trapped inside time. And that is precisely why faith becomes necessary. Human beings never stand where God stands. We see a fragment. We call it the whole. We see a moment. We fear it will last forever. We see an empire at its height and imagine it cannot fall. We see a promise delayed and wonder if it was forgotten. Habakkuk is learning that one of the most dangerous mistakes is to confuse what is visible with what is final. Babylon is visible. its end is not yet visible. But God's word concerns both. The Chaldeans may believe they control the timetable because they control armies. They do not. The vision has an appointed time. The empire may decide when it attacks a city. It cannot decide when God will hold it accountable. The conqueror may choose how many captives to take. He cannot choose whether pride will eventually face judgment. This is the beginning of Habakkuk's answer to the problem that nearly overwhelmed him. God's sovereignty does not mean Babylon is innocent. It means Babylon's evil is neither autonomous nor eternal. God can use the movements of a wicked empire within judgment while still judging that empire for its own wickedness. The Chaldeans are responsible for their arrogance, responsible for bloodshed, responsible for plunder, responsible for exploitation, responsible for idolatry. Being used in history does not make them morally pure. A sword does not become righteous simply because God can direct events through the hand holding it. This distinction protects two truths at once. God remains sovereign. Babylon remains guilty. Habakkuk does not have to choose between them. That is important because many simple answers would destroy one side of the biblical tension. If Babylon acts entirely outside God's sovereignty, then history becomes a realm God cannot govern. But if Babylon's actions are automatically righteous simply because God uses the empire, then evil is renamed good. Habakkuk is given neither option. God rules. Babylon sins. God judges Judah. God will judge Babylon. The divine purpose does not erase human responsibility. And now the prophet is ready to hear exactly what that responsibility includes. The vision begins to unfold in a series of accusations, not vague accusations, specific ones. Babylon's wealth has a history. Its cities have a history. Its glory has a history. Its power has a history. Behind imperial magnificence stand plundered peoples. Behind security stand homes taken from others. Behind monuments stand blood. Behind celebrations stand humiliation. Behind the idols stand human hands that made them. Habakkuk had asked whether the conqueror would continue devouring nations forever. God's answer is about to expose the empire piece by piece. 5 cries of judgment will fall upon Babylon. 5 woes. Each one will attack a different illusion. The illusion that stolen wealth can provide permanent security. The illusion that a powerful house can place itself beyond disaster. The illusion that cities built by blood can become monuments to lasting glory. The illusion that humiliating others proves superiority. And the illusion that something made by human hands can save the human being who made it. Babylon's strength is about to be placed under moral examination, and once that examination begins, the empire looks very different. From a distance, Babylon looks glorious. Up close, the foundations are stained. From a distance, it looks secure. Up close, its own actions are accumulating witnesses against it. From a distance, it appears alive with power. At its spiritual center, it bows to things that cannot speak. Habakkuk wanted to know whether God had seen Babylon's evil. The 5 woes will answer that question unmistakably. Nothing has been missed. Every act of exploitation matters. Every stolen possession matters. Every life taken for imperial ambition matters. Every humiliation matters. Every idol exposes the emptiness beneath the empire's confidence. The judgment may wait for its appointed time, but the record is already complete, and perhaps that is part of what Habakkuk needed to understand. Delay is not blindness. Patience is not approval. Silence is not forgetfulness. God does not need to judge an empire immediately in order to see it perfectly. The appointed time allows evil to reveal itself fully, without granting evil the final word. Habakkuk is still not standing at the end of the story. He is standing before a promise. The Babylonians have not yet disappeared. The vision has not yet become visible history. But the prophet now has something he did not possess when he first climbed the Watchtower: a framework for waiting. The proud live as though they are self-sufficient. The righteous live by faith. The proud treat delay as permission. The righteous treat God's word as certain, even in delay. The proud consume because they believe accumulation is life. The righteous receive life from a source no invading army can ultimately control. And here, in the middle of a book about nations' violence, judgment, and empire, the real battle becomes unexpectedly personal. What will Habakkuk trust? Will he measure reality by Babylon's visible power or by God's invisible promise? Will he allow delay to become despair, or will waiting become the place where faith is formed? The answer will not remain theoretical. Habakkuk will eventually stand before the possibility that everything supporting ordinary life could disappear. Food, fields, flocks, security, the structures by which a family survives from one season to the next. Before he can reach that final declaration of trust, however, he must understand what kind of empire is threatening his world, and why its apparent greatness carries within it the certainty of judgment. So the vision turns toward Babylon. The conqueror that gathered nations is about to hear the nations speak back. The empire that believed strength was its god is about to discover what strength cannot protect. And one accusation after another will begin with the same terrible word: woe. The word falls like a verdict over Babylon. Woe. Habakkuk had asked whether the conqueror would continue emptying his net forever. God's answer now turns the empire's own history into evidence against it. Babylon has gathered nations. Now the nations speak. Babylon has mocked kings. Now Babylon becomes the object of a taunt. Babylon has taken what belonged to others. Now the question is no longer whether judgment will come, but how completely the empire's own actions will testify against it. The vision of Habakkuk chapter 2 unfolds through a series of 5 woes. Each exposes a different form of corruption. Each reveals another layer beneath imperial greatness, and together they answer the prophet's question with increasing force. God has seen everything. The first woe concerns plunder. Babylon has accumulated what does not belong to it. Its wealth has been enlarged through conquest. Its rulers have taken from nations stripped cities and treated the possessions of others as the spoils of victory. From the imperial capital, this wealth could look like evidence of success. Treasures arrived, tribute flowed, defeated peoples financed the greatness of the conqueror. But Habakkuk's vision reverses the perspective. What Babylon calls wealth, the victims call theft. What Babylon calls tribute, the conquered remember as loss. What the empire displays as glory has a history, and that history is not forgotten. The vision asks, how long? The same question Habakkuk once directed toward God is now turned toward Babylon. How long can stolen wealth accumulate? How long can a conqueror increase what is not his? The answer is contained in the reversal that follows. Those who were plundered will rise. The debtor will discover that the debt can be called in. The one who seized from many nations will himself become spoil. Babylon assumed that victory changed ownership permanently. God says there is another accounting. This does not mean every individual act of loss will be reversed in the exact form it occurred. Habakkuk is speaking about the moral destiny of an empire. The point is larger. Violence does not become righteous merely because it produces profit. Plunder does not become legitimate merely because the thief has an army. And stolen abundance does not become secure merely because no human rival can immediately take it back. Babylon has shed blood. Babylon has violated lands. Babylon has devastated cities and the people within them. Those actions stand behind the first woe like witnesses. The empire is not judged simply because it is powerful. It is judged for what it has done with power. That distinction matters. Power itself is not the accusation. Abuse of power is. And the first woe reveals the instability of everything built through predatory accumulation. Babylon believes possession creates security. But possession gained through injustice creates enemies, memories, resentment, and guilt. The empire may hold the treasure. It does not control the moral meaning of how the treasure was obtained. The second woe moves from wealth to security. Woe to the one who gains evil gain for his house, setting his nest on high so that he may be safe from disaster. The image is powerful. A bird builds a nest in a high place, beyond the reach of danger. Babylon seeks the same thing politically. Gather enough wealth, defeat enough enemies, build high enough, fortify strongly enough, eliminate enough rivals. Then perhaps no disaster can reach you. This is the dream beneath many forms of human ambition, to construct a position from which vulnerability disappears. Babylon wants its nest above judgment, but no human structure can be built that high. The tragedy is that the empire attempts to create security through the destruction of others. It cuts off peoples. It conquers nations. It expands its house at the expense of other houses. And in doing so, the very project intended to protect Babylon becomes evidence against Babylon. Habakkuk describes the building itself as though it can speak. The stone cries out from the wall. The beam answers from the woodwork. The image is almost haunting. Babylon might silence a conquered population. It cannot silence what its greatness represents. Imagine an imperial building constructed from the wealth of defeated lands. Its polished walls tell one story to the ruler's strength, prosperity, permanence. But the prophet hears another story. The stones remember the price. The beams testify to the violence behind the architecture. The house itself becomes a witness. That is the second reversal. Babylon tried to build a monument to security. Instead, it built testimony. The lesson reaches beyond one ancient empire. Human beings often believe that if the evidence of wrongdoing can be incorporated into something impressive enough, the wrongdoing disappears. A palace can hide exploitation behind beauty. A victory monument can hide grief behind triumph. A prosperous city can hide the suffering required to feed its expansion. But magnificence cannot change moral reality. The stones may be silent to human ears. In Habakkuk's vision, they still cry out before God. The third woe moves from the house to the city. Woe to the one who builds a town with blood and establishes a city through iniquity. Now the accusation becomes unmistakable. Babylon's civilization cannot be judged only by what it produces. It must also be judged by what it costs. Cities can represent extraordinary human achievement. Walls, temples, roads, markets, archives, palaces, systems of administration, places where art, trade, language, and power converge. Babylon would become famous for grandeur, but Habakkuk strips grandeur away long enough to ask what lies underneath it. If a city is built with blood, can its magnificence make the blood disappear? If glory requires crushing others, is it truly glory? If an empire turns human lives into building material for its ambition, how long can that project endure? The answer is devastating. The peoples labor for what will ultimately feed the fire. Nations exhaust themselves for something that cannot last. All the energy poured into human greatness becomes temporary when greatness is separated from righteousness. This is not a condemnation of building civilization or human creativity. It is a condemnation of greatness purchased by violence. Babylon believes it can create immortality through architecture and empire. God declares that history is moving toward a different kind of glory. Then comes one of the most expansive statements in the entire book. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The contrast could hardly be greater. Babylon wants the earth filled with the knowledge of Babylon. Its victories advertise its name. Its monuments proclaim its achievements. Its armies carry its authority across borders. Its king wants nations to know who rules. But Babylon's glory is local, temporary, dependent on military success. God's glory is not. The empire is trying to fill the earth by conquest. The vision says the earth will ultimately be filled by the knowledge of the Lord. Babylon's ambition is therefore exposed as both violent and small. An empire may control vast territory and still occupy only a moment. A king may place his name on buildings and still become a chapter in someone else's history. The purposes of God extend beyond the lifespan of every empire. This is one of the points at which Habakkuk's horizon expands again. His first concern was Judah, then Babylon. Now the vision reaches toward the earth. The prophet is being moved from local crisis toward cosmic perspective. Judah matters. Babylon matters. The violence matters. The judgment matters. But none of them defines the final horizon of God's purpose. The earth will not ultimately be filled with the fear of Babylon. It will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. That does not remove the immediate crisis. Babylon is still coming, but it places the crisis inside a larger future. Habakkuk has been afraid that Babylon might have the last word. The vision answers by showing him a world in which Babylon is not even the central subject. God is. If this story is helping you see how Habakkuk's questions connect to the larger biblical story, save this documentary so you can return to the timeline later. And if you want to keep exploring Scripture as one connected story rather than isolated scenes, continue with us through the rest of this journey, because the vision is not finished. The fourth woe becomes even darker. It concerns humiliation. Babylon does not merely defeat, it degrades. Habakkuk uses the image of making a neighbor drink, pouring out wrath until the person is intoxicated and exposed. The language is intentionally shameful. This is domination turned into spectacle. The powerful person does not simply want the weaker person defeated, he wants him dishonored. The conqueror wants to look upon the humiliation of the conquered. This is violence beyond strategic necessity. It is cruelty enjoying its own superiority. And once again, the vision reverses the direction. Babylon has made others drink. Now Babylon will drink. The cup will turn. The empire that gloried in another person's shame will be covered with shame itself. The image of the cup is significant in prophetic language. A cup can represent judgment, something a person or nation must drink and experience fully. Here the reversal is moral and poetic. You poured out humiliation, now humiliation comes to you. You sought glory through another person's disgrace, now disgrace covers what you called glory. Habakkuk is being shown a pattern. The empire's sins contain the shape of its judgment. It plunders. It will be plundered. It creates false security through destruction. Its security will fail. It builds with blood. Its glory will not endure. It humiliates others. Its own glory will turn to shame. This is not random punishment. The judgment reveals the true nature of the sin. Babylon has built an identity around domination. When its power disappears, the emptiness beneath that identity will become visible. Habakkuk also refers to violence done against Lebanon and the destruction of animals. the language expands the indictment beyond human political centers. Imperial appetite scars land as well as cities. Conquest affects forests, animals, fields, roads, villages, the physical world through which armies move. Habakkuk's accusation does not allow Babylon to reduce war to the defeat of rival governments. Violence spreads. The land bears consequences. Creatures bear consequences. Civilian populations bear consequences. Cities bear consequences. God's moral vision is wider than the conqueror's military report. Babylon counts victories. The prophet counts the cost. Again the refrain returns. Because of human bloodshed and violence against lands, cities, and their inhabitants. Habakkuk had wondered whether God saw the victims swallowed by the Chaldean net. The answer has become unmistakable. He sees them. The fifth and final woe reaches beneath every previous sin: plunder, false security, bloodshed, humiliation. What sits beneath a civilization convinced that its own power is ultimate? Idolatry. Habakkuk turns toward the carved image. What value is an idol carved by its maker? What can a metal image teach it? The craftsman makes it, then trusts it. Human hands create the object, then human hearts place hope in what they created. The absurdity is intentional. The idol cannot speak, yet someone asks it for guidance. It cannot breathe, yet someone seeks life from it. It has been shaped by a human being. Yet the human being bows. Habakkuk declares, "Woe to the one who says to wood, awake, or to silent stone, arise. Can it teach? It may be covered with gold and silver, its appearance may be impressive, its craftsmanship may be extraordinary, but there is no breath within it." The final exposure of Babylon, therefore, takes place not on a battlefield, but in worship. What does Babylon trust its military power, its wealth, its instruments of conquest, its idols? All share one fatal weakness: they cannot give life. An army can take life, it cannot become the source of life. Gold can purchase influence, it cannot speak truth. A carved image can be decorated, it cannot answer. A king can command subjects, he cannot make himself eternal. Babylon's deepest error is not merely that it does violent things. It has placed ultimate trust in things that are not God. That is why its strength became its God. The empire took something real, military power, and gave it an ultimate place. It did the same with wealth, with conquest, with human craftsmanship, with imperial glory. Idolatry is not always trusting something imaginary. Sometimes it is taking something real and demanding from it what only God can provide. Security, identity, meaning, final authority, life. Babylon's idols reveal the spiritual logic of its empire. What can be controlled is trusted. What can be built is worshipped. What produces results is honored. What appears powerful is treated as ultimate. And then Habakkuk reaches one of the most dramatic contrasts in the entire book. The idol is silent because it cannot speak. Then the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Everything turns. For several verses, Babylon has been noisy. Armies, building, drinking, boasting, conquering, calling to idols, celebrating strength. The empire fills the world with the sound of itself. Then God speaks a sentence that makes all human noise small. The Lord is in his holy temple. Silence. Not the silence Habakkuk feared at the beginning. This is different. At the beginning of the book, Habakkuk experienced silence as though God were absent. Now the earth is commanded to be silent because God is present. That is a profound reversal. Habakkuk once cried because heaven seemed quiet. Now creation becomes quiet before heaven. The silence is no longer emptiness, it is reverence. Babylon's gods cannot speak. The living God does not need to shout. Babylon believes its armies determine reality. The Lord remains enthroned. Babylon believes its monuments prove permanence. The Lord remains enthroned. Babylon believes conquered nations prove superiority. The Lord remains enthroned. The empire may shake kingdoms, it does not shake God's throne. For Habakkuk, this changes the posture of the entire conversation. He began by speaking. "How long?" Then God answered. Habakkuk spoke again. "How can you use Babylon?" Then he stood on the tower, waiting for another answer. Now the answer has expanded until there is little left for argument. Babylon will not escape judgment. Its crimes have been named. Its pride has been exposed. Its idols have been revealed as breathless. Its future is bounded by an appointed time. And above everything stands the living God. Habakkuk has not received a promise that the coming years will be painless. He has received a reason to stop treating Babylon's power as ultimate. That is not the same thing. The prophet still knows judgment is approaching Judah. He still knows Chaldean forces are terrifying. He still knows fields can be destroyed, cities can fall, and nations can suffer. God has not told him that faith will prevent every loss. Instead, God has shown him that loss cannot dethrone God. This is where the journey must move from argument toward worship. So far, Habakkuk has spoken to God about what he sees. In chapter 3, he begins speaking to God about what he remembers. The difference will transform him. When the future is frightening, memory becomes spiritually important, not nostalgia, not pretending the past was perfect. Habakkuk will remember God's acts because the God who acted in the past is the same God whose purposes he cannot fully see in the present. The prophet has heard of the Lord's work. Now he asks for that work to be renewed. He knows judgment is coming, yet he asks, in wrath, remember mercy. That prayer tells us that Habakkuk's understanding is deepening. At first he wanted action. Now he understands action may include judgment. At first he wanted explanation. Now he asks for mercy. At first he looked at evil and demanded that God intervene. Now he trembles before what divine intervention can mean. This is not contradiction. It is maturity. Habakkuk is discovering that it is one thing to ask for justice in principle. It is another to stand near the fire when justice comes. The prophet is no longer speaking as though he stands outside the crisis. He knows Judah is part of it. He knows Babylon will not escape it. And he knows human beings survive only because judgment is not the whole story. Mercy must be remembered. Chapter 3 will therefore sound very different from the first two chapters. The legal argument gives way to poetry. The Watchtower gives way to prayer. The empire fades temporarily into the background, and the prophet's imagination fills with images of God's power. Mountains trembling, waters surging, light flashing, nations shaking. The language reaches back toward the great saving acts associated with Israel's past. The God who delivered, the God who appeared, the God before whom creation itself seemed to move. Habakkuk is about to place Babylon inside a much older story. Babylon may be new as the dominant threat of his generation. God is not new. Babylon may have a frightening army. Israel has seen empires before. Babylon may imagine history begins with its victories. Habakkuk will remember that God's acts began long before the first Chaldean horse crossed toward Judah. And something begins to happen to the prophet. His questions have not all disappeared, but they are losing their power to define him. He is moving from demanding that God fit his understanding toward allowing his understanding to be reshaped by who God is. Soon Habakkuk will tremble. He will describe fear physically. his body will react to the thought of the coming disaster. This is important because his final faith will not be the faith of a man who feels nothing. It will be the faith of a man who feels fear and still trusts. But before he can say, "Yet I will rejoice," he must remember the God in whom that rejoicing is possible. The 5 woes have exposed Babylon. Now Habakkuk's prayer will reveal God. The empire has had its moment in the vision, its plunder, its bloodshed, its pride, its idols, its coming shame. Now the prophet turns his eyes away from the greatness of Babylon and toward a greatness that cannot be conquered. The argument is ending, the prayer is beginning, and the man who once demanded to know why God had not acted is about to remember what happens when the living God rises in power. Habakkuk has reached the point where argument gives way to prayer. He has asked why evil is allowed to continue. He has questioned why Babylon would be used as an instrument of judgment. He has stood on the watchtower and waited. He has heard that the proud will not endure. He has been told that the righteous must live by faith. He has listened as Babylon's greed, bloodshed, humiliation, idolatry, and false security were exposed one by one. Now the prophet does something different. He prays. Habakkuk chapter 3 does not begin with another accusation. It begins with remembrance. The prophet has heard the report of God's work, and what he has heard fills him with awe. He asks the Lord to revive his work in the midst of the years, to make it known, and then adds one of the most important requests in the entire book. In wrath, remember mercy. That prayer reveals how far Habakkuk has traveled. At the beginning, he wanted God to act against evil. Now he understands that divine action is not something to request casually. Judgment is coming. Judah's corruption has consequences. Babylon itself will eventually face judgment. And Habakkuk suddenly sees that if the holy God deals with human rebellion purely according to what it deserves, no one should speak lightly about the result. So he asks for mercy. Not instead of justice, within justice. Habakkuk does not ask God to pretend that sin does not matter. He does not ask God to call evil good. He asks that even when judgment moves through history, mercy will not be forgotten. That is one of the deepest transformations in his prayer. At first, Habakkuk was primarily concerned with what evil people deserved. Now he has become more aware of what everyone needs: mercy. And from that prayer, the language of the book changes dramatically. The prophet begins to describe God coming in majesty. The imagery is immense. It reaches beyond one city, beyond Judah, beyond Babylon, beyond the immediate political crisis. Habakkuk sees the glory of God covering the heavens. Praise fills the earth. Brightness surrounds him. Light flashes from his hand. Power is hidden within the radiance. The prophet is no longer looking first at Babylonian cavalry. He is looking at the God before whom every army is small. This does not mean he has forgotten Babylon. It means Babylon has been placed in proportion. Fear often enlarges whatever threatens us until it fills the whole horizon. Habakkuk's prayer pushes the horizon back. Babylon is powerful, but Babylon is not the largest reality in the story. The crisis is real, but the crisis is not God. The empire is visible, but visibility does not equal supremacy. Habakkuk begins remembering the God who has acted in history before. The language of chapter 3 echoes the great traditions of Israel's past: the wilderness, Sinai, the Exodus, the march of God before his people, the trembling of nations, the shaking of creation, the God who intervened when Israel had no army capable of defeating Egypt by its own strength, the God who brought a people out of slavery, the God whose presence transformed a mountain into a place of fear and holiness, the God who led through wilderness when no ordinary political strategy could explain survival, Habakkuk's generation faces Babylon. Earlier generations faced powers that also appeared unbeatable. That memory matters. Egypt once looked permanent. It was not. Assyria once appeared unstoppable. It was not. Now Babylon is rising, and may imagine that the same pattern will somehow stop with Babylon. Habakkuk's prayer refuses to grant the empire that privilege. No kingdom receives an exemption from mortality. No army becomes eternal by winning enough battles. No king becomes God by controlling enough land. The prophet now remembers what human rulers repeatedly forget. History existed before them, and history will continue after them. Only God stands beyond it. The poetry intensifies. Habakkuk sees pestilence and plague accompanying the divine advance. Mountains appear to rive. Ancient hills sink low. The language is not trying to provide a geographical travel diary. This is prophetic poetry. Creation itself is pictured as responding to the presence of God. What looks ancient to human beings is temporary before Him. Mountains symbolize stability. Hills appear immovable. Generations live and die while they remain. Yet before God, even ancient hills are not ultimate. Habakkuk needs that image because Babylon's political power also looks immovable. The prophet is learning to measure apparent permanence against the one whose ways are everlasting. He mentions Cushan and Midian trembling. Again, the perspective is wider than Judah. God's acts do not belong to one frightened generation. They stand within a much longer memory. The nations have trembled before. The question is not whether Babylon appears strong now. The question is whether Babylon is somehow different from every other power that eventually stood beneath God's judgment. It is not. Then Habakkuk turns toward the waters. Was the Lord angry with the rivers? Was His wrath against the sea? The questions are poetic. The answer is not that God wages war against water for its own sake. The imagery recalls the God who makes a way where human beings see no way. For Israel, water had already become part of the vocabulary of salvation. The sea that looked like an impossible barrier during the Exodus became the place through which deliverance came. Later, the Jordan stood between Israel and the land they were entering. Water can represent chaos, danger, limitation, but none of it limits God. Habakkuk sees divine chariots. He sees the bow made ready. He pictures the earth split by rivers. Mountains see God and tremble. Waters sweep past. The deep gives forth its voice. The language grows cosmic because Habakkuk is contemplating sovereignty on a scale Babylon cannot approach. The Chaldeans command soldiers. God commands no ordinary army alone. Creation itself is described as responding to Him. Babylon can redirect roads. It can tear down walls. It can dam or cross waterways through engineering and military effort. But the Lord stands above the created order itself. This is why Habakkuk's memory is not escapism. He is not distracting himself from Babylon with beautiful religious poetry. He is reordering his understanding of power. When fear dominates perception, the threat becomes the standard by which everything else is measured. Habakkuk is doing the opposite. He measures the threat by God. That does not make the threat imaginary. It makes it finite. The prophet continues, "The sun and moon stand still in their place at the light of God's arrows, at the flash of His spear." The imagery recalls moments in Israel's sacred memory when creation itself seemed drawn into God's saving acts. Habakkuk is not giving us a calm, philosophical definition of divine sovereignty. He is singing it. The God who appears in his prayer is not passive. He marches through the earth. He threshes the nations. Then comes the purpose behind the divine advance. God went out for the salvation of His people, for the salvation of His anointed. That line matters because Habakkuk's vision of judgment is not merely destructive. God's opposition to evil is connected to his commitment to save. The prophet who feared that the wicked would devour endlessly is now remembering that history contains acts of deliverance as well as judgment. God crushes the head of the wicked house. He lays bare its foundation. The image is total. Human evil often presents itself through structures, houses, dynasties, kingdoms, systems, strongholds. Habakkuk imagines judgment reaching not merely the surface, but the foundation. This is the opposite of Babylon's attempt to build a nest so high that disaster could never reach it. There is no height beyond God. There is no foundation hidden from him. There is no political structure so deeply established that it becomes morally untouchable. The prophet then describes enemies coming like a whirlwind. They rejoice as though they are about to devour the poor in secret. The image connects strongly with the book's earlier concern for violent power. The oppressor believes the vulnerable are easy prey. The powerful celebrate before the battle is even finished. They assume the outcome. They imagine the weak have no defender. But Habakkuk's prayer remembers a God who overturns such certainty. The weapons of the wicked are turned against their own leaders. The one who comes to devour can himself be struck. Again the pattern appears. Evil contains the seeds of reversal. The conqueror does not remain conqueror forever. The hunter can become hunted. The empire that creates fear can one day experience fear. Habakkuk is learning that the present arrangement of power does not define the final arrangement of justice. Then the image returns to the sea. God marches through the waters with his horses. The great waters surge. The entire section has the emotional force of a storm. Light, mountains, rivers, sea, weapons, marching, nations, deliverance, judgment. Habakkuk has moved far from the stillness of the Watchtower, but something important is happening beneath all the imagery. The prophet is not receiving new information about Babylon's military schedule. He is rebuilding confidence through the memory of God's character. There are times when the answer to fear is not more information. It is a larger understanding of the one in whom trust is placed. Habakkuk already knows enough to be frightened. More details about the Chaldean army would not save him from fear. He needs something stronger than a forecast. He needs perspective. Who is God? What has he done? What kind of God is he when nations rage? What kind of God is he when his people are weak? What kind of God is he when judgment is deserved? What kind of God is he when human strength appears absolute? Habakkuk's prayer answers through remembrance. He is the God who acts, the God who judges, the God who saves, the God whose holiness makes evil temporary, the God whose mercy can still be requested in wrath, the God whose purposes cannot be reduced to the rise or fall of one empire. This is what makes memory so powerful in biblical faith. Israel is repeatedly told to remember. Remember the Exodus. Remember the wilderness. Remember the covenant. Remember the commandments. Remember what happened when previous generations forgot. Biblical remembrance is not simply recalling old information. It reshapes present obedience. If God was faithful before, the past becomes evidence for trust now. That does not mean God will repeat every event in exactly the same form. Habakkuk is not expecting another Red Sea simply because there was one before. He is remembering a pattern of divine character. God is not absent. God is not powerless. God does not become less holy because Babylon has more soldiers. God's promises do not become invalid because the visible world becomes unstable. This kind of remembrance does something to Habakkuk, but it does not make him fearless. That is crucial. The next lines show the prophet's body reacting violently to what he has heard. His faith is growing. His nerves still tremble. He hears and his body shakes. His lips quiver. Decay seems to enter his bones. His legs tremble beneath him. Habakkuk does not move from fear to faith by becoming emotionally numb. He does not suddenly speak as though invasion is a minor inconvenience. He does not deny the suffering ahead. The coming day of trouble remains so real that he feels it physically. This makes his final confession far more powerful. Anyone can sound courageous when danger is abstract. Habakkuk knows enough to tremble. He understands what invasion can mean. Crops destroyed, trade disrupted, cities besieged, families displaced. The foundations of ordinary life collapsing. He knows Judah has not been promised an easy escape from consequences. He knows Babylon's arrival may be catastrophic. And still beneath the shaking of his body, another kind of stability is beginning to form. He says he will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon the invading people. Once again, wait. The word returns. Earlier, Habakkuk waited on the Watchtower for an answer. Now he waits for the fulfillment of judgment. But he is no longer waiting in the same way. At the Watchtower, he waited because he did not understand what God would say. Now he waits because he has heard enough to know that Babylon's story has an appointed end. His uncertainty has not vanished. But uncertainty no longer means meaninglessness. He does not know every step. He knows the direction. The proud will not endure forever. The violent empire will be judged. The righteous must live by faith. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. The Lord is in his holy temple. These truths form the structure beneath Habakkuk's trembling. Faith does not always remove fear immediately. Sometimes faith is what keeps fear from becoming the final authority. Habakkuk trembles, but he waits. His lips quiver, but he remembers. His body feels weak, but he has not abandoned God. This is not the confidence of someone who believes nothing bad can happen to him. It is the confidence of someone who knows bad things may happen and has discovered that God's faithfulness is deeper than the protection of circumstances. And this prepares the prophet for the final test. Until now, the crisis has been described mostly through nations and armies. Judah, Babylon, kings, conquest, judgment. But Habakkuk is about to make the question intensely personal. What if national crisis reaches the field outside your home? What if theological truth must survive an empty barn? What if invasion means there are no grapes on the vine, no olives, no grain, no sheep, no cattle? What if the economic structure supporting ordinary life disappears? Ancient Judah was an agricultural society. For most people, food did not begin in a market stocked by invisible supply chains. Life depended directly on land, rain, harvest, trees, vines, flocks, herds. A failed harvest was not merely disappointing, it threatened survival. The fig tree represented food. The vine represented produce and celebration. The olive produced oil used in daily life. Fields produced grain. Sheep provided food and material. Cattle represented wealth and agricultural strength. Habakkuk is about to imagine the failure of all of them. Not one, all. That is important because his final declaration is sometimes quoted without the weight of what comes before it. Yet I will rejoice sounds beautiful when removed from context. Inside Habakkuk, it is almost shocking. The prophet does not say, even if one plan fails, he imagines complete agricultural collapse. Even if the visible signs of provision disappear, even if the economy of ordinary life stops functioning, even if nothing around him looks like evidence that circumstances are improving, then what? This is the question toward which the entire book has been moving. At the beginning, Habakkuk's faith was disturbed because he could not understand God's inactivity. Then it was disturbed because he could not understand God's activity. Now the test becomes deeper. Can he trust God even when neither explanation nor circumstance gives him immediate comfort? Can faith survive not only unanswered questions, but actual loss? Can worship continue when the field is empty? Can joy exist without pretending the field is full? Habakkuk is almost ready to answer. But notice what had to happen first. He had to speak honestly. He had to hear God's answer. He had to struggle with that answer. He had to wait. He had to learn the difference between pride and faith. He had to hear Babylon's sins exposed. He had to remember that judgment has an appointed time. He had to turn from imperial power toward divine glory. He had to remember what God had done before. And he had to acknowledge his fear. Only then can the final confession carry its true weight. Unshakable faith is not produced by skipping the struggle. Habakkuk reaches it by passing through the struggle. That is why his book never tells the reader that serious questions are the opposite of faith. The prophet's questions become part of the road by which his faith matures. At first he demands to know why. Later he learns to wait. Finally he will worship without possessing every answer. The questions have not all been resolved at the level of philosophical detail. Habakkuk does not receive a complete explanation of why every innocent person suffers in history. He does not receive a map of every future political event. He does not learn why God permits every particular act of evil. Instead, his confidence shifts from understanding every event to trusting the character of God within events he cannot fully understand. That is a much more demanding form of faith. A faith dependent upon explanations can collapse when explanations run out. Habakkuk is moving toward a faith rooted somewhere deeper, in God himself. The prophet has looked backward and remembered. Now he looks ahead. The trouble is still coming. His body still trembles. The land may fail. The economy may collapse. The things that normally tell a human being, "You are safe," may disappear one after another. And there at the edge of loss, Habakkuk will speak the words for which his book is remembered. Not because he no longer understands suffering, not because Babylon has suddenly become harmless, not because Judah has escaped judgment, but because somewhere between his first complaint and this final prayer, the foundation beneath his life has changed. His joy will no longer rest first in figs, or vines, or fields, or sheep, or cattle. Those things matter. Their loss hurts, but they are not God. And if every visible support is stripped away, Habakkuk is about to discover whether the statement he heard on the Watchtower has truly entered his life. The righteous shall live by faith. The prophet is trembling. The fields of the future may be empty. Babylon is still approaching. Nothing about the circumstances guarantees an easy ending. And yet Habakkuk is about to say the most defiant word in his entire book. Yet. Yet. One word stands between catastrophe and worship. Habakkuk has looked toward a future in which the structures supporting ordinary life may collapse. The fig tree may not blossom. There may be no fruit on the vines. The olive crop may fail. The fields may produce no food. The sheep may disappear from the fold. The cattle may be gone from the stalls. For an agricultural society, these are not decorative images. They are the architecture of survival. The fig tree takes years to mature. A vineyard represents labor invested across seasons. Olive trees can endure for generations and provide oil for food lamps, medicine trade, and worship. Fields mean grain. Flocks and herds mean food, clothing, wealth, work, and continuity. Habakkuk imagines not one disappointment, but layer after layer of loss. No figs, no grapes, no olives, No grain, no sheep, no cattle, nothing in the visible landscape says that life is improving. Nothing around the prophet appears to prove that God has suddenly removed the crisis. Babylon is still a threat. Judgment is still coming. The prophet's body still trembles, and then he says, Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. This is the great climax of Habakkuk's journey. Not because the external situation has been repaired, it has not. Not because the prophet has received a detailed explanation for every mystery, he has not. Not because the violence of history has vanished, it has not. Habakkuk rejoices before the resolution is visible. That is what makes his faith so extraordinary. At the beginning of the book, his emotional condition was shaped almost entirely by what he saw: violence, injustice, corruption, a law that seemed powerless, justice twisted by the wicked. Then his horizon expanded and he saw Babylon, a second terror, an empire greater than Judah, an army moving quickly, a nation that trusted its own power and worshipped its strength. Habakkuk's world seemed to become darker each time God answered. Yet somewhere along the way the prophet's foundation moved. At first he needed the world around him to make sense before he could find peace. Now he has reached a place where peace is rooted in the character of God, even when the world around him remains frightening. This is not irrational optimism. Habakkuk is not saying that failed crops are secretly good. He does not call famine pleasant. He does not romanticize invasion. He does not pretend that losing animals, food, land, or security should produce happiness in itself. Biblical faith does not require us to rename suffering. Habakkuk knows loss is loss. That is exactly why the word yet matters. The prophet does not rejoice because the fig tree fails. He rejoices despite the failure. He does not rejoice because the stalls are empty. He rejoices in the Lord when they are empty. The object of his joy has changed. Earlier in the book, his questions were tied to what God was doing. Why are you allowing this? Why are you using Babylon? How long will Babylon continue? Now the prophet's confession is tied more deeply to who God is. I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God himself has become the center, not the explanation, not the harvest, not the political outcome. God. This is where Habakkuk's faith becomes unshakable, not because nothing can shake his emotions. We have already seen him trembling. Not because nothing can shake his nation. Judah is about to face catastrophe. Not because nothing can shake the economy. He has just imagined total agricultural failure. His faith becomes unshakable because its final foundation has been moved away from things that can be taken. The field can be taken. The flock can be taken. The city can be taken. Political stability can be taken. Wealth can be taken. Even a familiar way of life can disappear. But Habakkuk has discovered that the God of his salvation cannot be reduced to any of those things. That distinction is everything. There is a form of faith that works only while the harvest is good. It believes when the vines are full. It celebrates while the barns are stocked. It speaks confidently while the city is secure. But if prosperity becomes the evidence that God is trustworthy, then suffering will always threaten to become evidence that he is not. Habakkuk has passed beyond that fragile equation. His confidence is no longer God is faithful because my circumstances are favorable. It is God is faithful even when my circumstances no longer provide visible proof. That kind of faith can survive Babylon. This does not mean circumstances are irrelevant. Habakkuk has spent nearly the entire book caring intensely about circumstances. The violence mattered, the injustice mattered, the corrupt courts mattered, the Babylonian threat mattered, the victims mattered. Faith does not make those realities unimportant. It simply refuses to make them ultimate. That is the difference. The prophet can grieve what is happening without concluding that God has ceased to be God. He can tremble without surrendering hope. He can wait without interpreting delay as abandonment. He can face loss without worshiping what has been lost. This is what the proud cannot do. Remember the contrast at the center of chapter 2? The proud person is swollen with self-reliance. The righteous person lives by faith. Babylon needs visible power. Habakkuk learns to live without visible security. Babylon needs possession. Habakkuk prepares to trust even without harvest. Babylon needs to conquer. Habakkuk learns to wait. Babylon says, "My strength is my God." Habakkuk says, "The Lord is my strength." That contrast reaches its fullest form at the end of the book. The two ways of living could not be more different. Babylon builds identity through what it can take. Habakkuk builds identity around the one who cannot be taken. Babylon seeks security by placing its nest high. Habakkuk finds security even when the visible nest has been stripped bare. Babylon enlarges its appetite like the grave. Habakkuk is learning that life is not measured by accumulation. Babylon's strength eventually becomes the source of its pride. Habakkuk's weakness becomes the place where dependence on God is revealed. Then he declares, "The Lord God is my strength." Notice the progression. Earlier, Habakkuk described God as his rock. Now, after the questions, the waiting, the vision, the woes, the prayer, and the trembling, the confession becomes embodied. God is not merely strong. God is my strength. That is personal trust. The prophet is no longer speaking only about what should happen to Babylon. He is speaking about what sustains him. This is the answer to one of the deepest questions of the book. What does the righteous person live by when circumstances offer no stability? Faith. What does that faith actually look like? Habakkuk shows us. It looks like waiting when fulfillment is delayed. It looks like refusing to worship visible power. It looks like remembering God's past faithfulness. It looks like asking for mercy. It looks like trembling honestly. And finally, it looks like rejoicing in God before the fig tree blossoms again. The prophet continues with an image of strength and movement. God makes his feet like those of a deer and enables him to walk on the heights. The picture is not of a heavy warhorse crushing enemies. It is of sure footing. A deer can move across difficult terrain with confidence where a human being might stumble. The image fits Habakkuk's journey perfectly. He has not been promised flat ground. He has been given strength to walk difficult ground. He has not been promised that every valley will disappear. He has been given footing on the heights. Faith does not always mean that God removes the terrain. Sometimes it means he enables his people to move through terrain they could not master by themselves. Habakkuk began overwhelmed by what he saw. Now he ends standing. That is the victory of the book. Not the fall of Babylon, not yet. Not the restoration of Judah, not yet. The first victory occurs inside the prophet. Fear has not been erased. It has been placed beneath trust. Questions have not been erased. They have been placed beneath worship. The future has not become predictable. It has been placed beneath the sovereignty of God. And that is why Habakkuk's final words have endured across centuries. They speak to a form of human experience that does not belong to one ancient crisis. There are moments when faith must live without visible abundance. There are moments when a believer looks for fruit and sees empty branches, looks for security and sees uncertainty, looks for immediate justice and sees delay, looks for an explanation and receives only enough light for the next step. Habakkuk does not provide a formula for making those moments disappear. He offers a way to stand inside them. But we must be careful not to flatten his message into a modern slogan. Habakkuk is not teaching that every personal disappointment is equivalent to the Babylonian crisis. Nor does he promise that sincere faith will always produce material restoration in this life. The final confession is powerful precisely because restoration has not yet arrived. If the book ended with every tree suddenly producing twice as much fruit, the meaning would change. Habakkuk does not say, "I will rejoice, because I know the harvest will be enormous next month." He says, even if the harvest fails, I will rejoice in God. His joy is therefore not a transaction. It is not God gives me abundance, therefore I worship. It is God is still God, therefore I worship, even when abundance is absent. That is a radically different relationship. It is one reason the book begins with such intense honesty. Cheap faith cannot survive Habakkuk's questions. If faith is nothing more than a system for receiving favorable outcomes, Babylon destroys it immediately. If faith depends on understanding everything God does, Habakkuk's first divine answer destroys it. If faith depends on never feeling fear, chapter 3 destroys it. But if faith means steadfast trust in God's character while living inside unresolved history, then Habakkuk becomes one of Scripture's clearest portraits of it. This is also why the famous line from chapter 2 cannot be separated from the closing lines of chapter 3. "The righteous shall live by faith," is not merely a theological statement placed in the middle of the book. The ending shows what it looks like. The prophet hears that the righteous will live by faith. Then his world is imagined stripped of the ordinary means of life, and he still says, "Yet I will rejoice." Chapter 3 becomes the lived expression of chapter 2. Faith is no longer simply something Habakkuk has been told. It has become his posture. This is the climax at the level of the prophet, but there is also a historical climax moving behind him. Habakkuk's confession does not prevent Babylon from continuing to rise. In the years associated with this period, the geopolitical order of the ancient Near East would change dramatically. Assyria's dominance was collapsing. Babylon would emerge as the primary imperial power. Judah would become increasingly trapped between larger forces. Eventually, Babylonian armies would come against Jerusalem. The city would suffer. The temple would be destroyed. The Davidic monarchy would lose its throne in Jerusalem. Many Chaldeans would be taken into exile. The kind of devastation Habakkuk feared was not imaginary. The storm came. And that historical reality protects us from reading the book sentimentally. Faith did not exempt Judah from consequences. Habakkuk's prayer did not magically erase the history of rebellion that prophets had condemned. The people would experience the terrible cost of covenant unfaithfulness and imperial invasion. Yet Babylon did not have the final word either. The empire that appeared unstoppable would itself fall. Its dominance would not last forever. Another empire would rise. The Persians would eventually take Babylon. Exiles would be permitted to return. Jerusalem would be rebuilt. The temple would rise again. Human kingdoms would continue to change. Babylon's apparent permanence would be exposed as temporary. Exactly as the vision had required Habakkuk to believe. But even that later reversal would not complete everything Habakkuk's book points toward, because after Babylon came Persia. After Persia came other powers. Empires changed names. Human pride remained. Violence remained. Injustice remained. Idolatry remained. The question, how long, did not disappear from human history simply because one particular empire fell. That is why Habakkuk's message reaches beyond Babylon. The book does not merely tell us that one bad empire eventually lost. It establishes a pattern. Arrogance has an end. Violence is accountable. God sees what empires try to hide. Present power is not final power, and the righteous must live by faith while history moves toward an appointed conclusion they cannot fully see. This is where Habakkuk's words begin reaching into the New Testament. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul would quote Habakkuk's declaration that the righteous shall live by faith. In Romans, the line appears as Paul introduces the revelation of God's righteousness in the gospel. In Galatians, it appears within Paul's argument that no one is justified before God by the law. The writer of Hebrews also reaches back to Habakkuk in a context of endurance. That is important. The New Testament does not treat Habakkuk 2:4 as an insignificant line from an obscure prophet. It recognizes in that sentence a principle with enormous theological weight. But the original setting must not be forgotten. Before the line became part of later Christian theological argument, it was spoken into crisis. A prophet needed to know how to live while judgment approached. The answer was faith, steadfast trust, endurance based on the certainty of God's word. The New Testament takes that ancient declaration and shows its deeper significance within the gospel and the life of God's people. Paul sees faith as central to the revelation of God's righteousness and to justification. Hebrews places the language within a call to endure rather than shrink back. The same fundamental contrast remains. Pride trusts itself. Faith trusts God. Human strength cannot produce the life only God can give. This does not mean Habakkuk himself understood every later theological development that would be connected to his words. We should not force the prophet to speak with the vocabulary of centuries that came after him. Habakkuk spoke into his own historical moment, but Scripture later takes his words and places them within a larger unfolding revelation. That is one reason his 3 short chapters occupy such an important place in the biblical story. A crisis in Judah becomes part of a conversation about faith that reaches far beyond Judah. The prophet's question about Babylon eventually speaks to churches living under other empires. His call to wait reaches believers facing other forms of suffering. His contrast between pride and faith becomes part of the apostolic explanation of life before God. And his final rejoicing offers a portrait of trust that does not depend on favorable conditions. But there is another layer to the climax. Habakkuk's story also changes how we understand doubt. The title of this journey speaks of moving from doubt to unshakable faith. But Habakkuk's doubt must be understood carefully. He is not presented as a man who decides God does not exist. He is not a skeptic standing outside faith and mocking belief. His questions arise inside a relationship with God. That difference matters. Habakkuk doubts his understanding of what God is doing. He struggles to reconcile divine holiness with the events he sees. He challenges the apparent contradiction, but he keeps turning toward God, not away from him. His questions are prayers. His complaints are addressed to the one he still calls his God and his rock. His waiting assumes that God can answer. His final worship grows out of the same relationship that made the questions possible. So the movement of Habakkuk is not best described as atheism becoming belief. It is perplexity becoming trust, confusion becoming endurance, a faith dependent on understanding becoming a faith rooted in God's character. The questions do not destroy his faith. They expose where his faith needs to deepen. That distinction can protect us from 2 opposite mistakes. The first mistake is believing that genuine faith never asks difficult questions. Habakkuk proves otherwise. The second is believing that asking difficult questions automatically produces mature faith. That is not Habakkuk either. The prophet does not remain forever inside complaint. He listens. He waits. He receives correction. He allows the vision to reshape him. His honesty is important. His teachability is equally important. Habakkuk does not worship his questions. He brings them to God. Then he allows God's answer to challenge him. This is what makes his journey so complete. He begins by saying, in effect, I do not understand why you are not acting. Then, I do not understand how you can act through Babylon. Then, I will stand and wait for your answer. Then, the righteous will live by faith. Then, in wrath, remember mercy. Then I tremble. And finally, yet I will rejoice. Every stage matters. Remove the first complaint and the ending becomes shallow. Remove the waiting and the ending becomes rushed. Remove the fear and the ending becomes unrealistic. Remove the possibility of loss and the ending becomes easy. Habakkuk's faith has weight because it has passed through all of them. Now return to the empty landscape he imagines. No blossom, no fruit, no harvest, no flock, no herd. At the beginning of the book, such a scene might have become proof to Habakkuk that everything had gone wrong. At the end, it becomes the setting in which something deeper is revealed. There is a form of joy Babylon cannot confiscate. An invading army can seize grain. It cannot seize God. It can take animals. It cannot remove the covenant Lord from his throne. It can destroy buildings. It cannot turn the living God into a silent idol. It can force people into exile. It cannot make Babylon eternal. The Lord remains. That is why Habakkuk can rejoice, not because everything remains, because God remains. That may be the strongest sentence in the book's final movement. Everything visible can change. God remains. Kingdoms change. God remains. Harvests fail. God remains. Cities fall. God remains. Questions linger. God remains. Habakkuk's circumstances are unstable. His foundation no longer is. This is the point toward which his entire struggle has been moving. The prophet who once looked at history and saw only contradiction now looks at the same unstable history through a different center. He has not learned to predict every event. He has learned where to stand. The Lord is his strength, and because of that, the man who once stood trembling on a watchtower can now imagine walking securely on dangerous heights. The crisis has not disappeared, but the prophet has changed. And now one final question remains. What does Habakkuk's transformation mean in the larger story of Scripture? Why did one prophet's struggle with Judah, Babylon, evil judgment, and delay become important enough to echo through Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews? And after all the poetry, prophecy, and fear, what can we finally say about the question with which everything began? Why does God allow evil? Habakkuk will not give us the simplistic answer many people expect, but what he gives may be more enduring. The final part of his story must now gather every thread: the silence, the Chaldeans, the vision, the appointed time, the 5 woes, the trembling prophet, the empty fields, and the faith that survived them all. Habakkuk began with that question. He looked at Judah and saw violence. He saw wrongdoing. He saw conflict multiplying. He saw the law losing its power in public life. He saw justice bent until the wicked could surround the righteous, and he could not reconcile any of it with what he believed about God. So he cried out, "How long?" 3 chapters later, Habakkuk does not possess a simple philosophical formula that explains every act of suffering in human history. God never gives him one. Instead, the prophet receives something that changes him more deeply. He learns that God's apparent silence is not the same as God's absence. He learns that divine action may be far more complicated than the answer he expected. He learns that God can use nations within his purposes without declaring their violence righteous. He learns that the powerful are not beyond judgment simply because their judgment is delayed. He learns that pride has an appointed end. He learns that the righteous are called to live by faith while the fulfillment remains unseen. And finally, he learns that trust in God can survive even when the visible foundations of life collapse. This is the complete movement of Habakkuk, from "How long?" to "I will stand at my watchpost," to "The righteous shall live by faith," to "In wrath remember mercy," to "I tremble," and finally, "Yet I will rejoice." The circumstances did not become easier between those sentences. Habakkuk became deeper. That is the great transformation at the heart of the book. At the beginning, Habakkuk believed in God, but he struggled to understand God's government of history. By the end, he still does not understand everything, but he has discovered that faith does not require complete understanding before obedience becomes possible. That distinction answers the central tension of his story. Why does God allow evil? Habakkuk gives several parts of an answer, but he refuses to give us more than the text supports. First, evil is real. The Bible never asks Habakkuk to deny it. Judah's violence is real. Babylon's cruelty is real. The suffering of conquered peoples is real. The prophet's anguish is real. Scripture does not protect faith by pretending darkness is less dark than it actually is. Second, God's patience with evil does not mean God approves of evil. This was one of Habakkuk's first misunderstandings. He cried because wrongdoing continued, and assumed that continued wrongdoing meant God was not responding. But the story reveals a distinction between delay and indifference. Judgment had an appointed time. The wicked could not see it. Habakkuk could not calculate it. But delay did not erase accountability. Babylon's pride would eventually be judged. Its plunder was remembered. Its bloodshed was remembered. Its humiliation of others was remembered. Its idolatry was remembered. Nothing disappeared simply because punishment did not come immediately. This is one of the strongest answers Habakkuk gives to anyone who looks at evil and concludes that delay means moral chaos. Delay is not approval. Silence is not blindness. Patience is not surrender. Third, God's use of a wicked nation does not make that nation righteous. This may be the hardest truth in the book. Babylon could function within God's judgment against Judah while remaining guilty for Babylon's own arrogance and violence. The Chaldeans were not presented as saints. They were not praised for compassion. They were not described as defenders of covenant justice. Their own strength became their God. They swallowed nations. They plundered. They built through bloodshed. They humiliated. They trusted idols. And the same God who announced their rise also announced their judgment. This protects the story from a dangerous misunderstanding. Divine sovereignty does not turn human sin into virtue. Babylon remains responsible for Babylon. Judah remains responsible for Judah. God remains sovereign over both. Habakkuk does not explain exactly how divine sovereignty and human responsibility fit together at every philosophical level. He simply refuses to sacrifice either truth. Human beings act. Human beings are accountable. God rules history. God remains holy. And when those truths appear difficult to reconcile, Habakkuk does not discard one to make the others easier. He learns to live faithfully inside the mystery. Fourth, evil is not allowed to define the final horizon of history. This is where the statement in Habakkuk chapter 2 becomes so important. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Think about what that means inside the book. At the time, Babylon appears to be filling the earth with the knowledge of Babylon. Its armies carry its name. Its victories spread its reputation. Its wealth advertises its success. Its defeated enemies prove its strength. Its rulers can look at an expanding empire and imagine that history is bending permanently toward them. God gives Habakkuk a different horizon. The world does not end with Babylon. Its glory is temporary. Its control is temporary. Its reputation is temporary. God's purpose reaches farther. This is one reason the biblical story repeatedly warns against judging ultimate reality by whichever empire currently appears strongest. Egypt looked permanent. It was not. Assyria looked permanent. It was not. Babylon looked permanent. It was not. Persia would rise, then other powers. Kings would continue replacing kings. Borders would move. Armies would march beneath different banners. But Habakkuk had already learned the principle necessary to survive them. The present empire is never the eternal God. This would become historically visible in Babylon's own fate. The Neo-Babylonian Empire reached extraordinary power. Jerusalem eventually fell to Babylon. The temple was destroyed. Many of the people of Judah were taken into exile. From the perspective of a Judean captive, Babylon's victory could have seemed complete. The city of David had fallen. The temple had burned. The monarchy had been broken. The conqueror appeared to have won. But Babylon did not last. In 539 BC, Babylon itself fell to the Persian Empire. The political structure that had once seemed unstoppable passed into history. Persian policy later allowed Judean exiles to return and rebuild. Jerusalem rose again. The temple was reconstructed. Babylon had been powerful. Habakkuk had never denied that. It simply had never been final. And yet the return from exile was not the full solution to Habakkuk's question either. Because evil continued after Babylon, violence continued, empires continued, human beings continued placing trust in power, wealth, institutions, military strength, and idols of their own making. The deeper problem was larger than one nation. This is why Habakkuk's words survived Babylon. His book addresses a pattern repeating throughout human history. The proud soul builds itself around self-sufficiency. The righteous live by faith. That statement becomes one of the great bridges between Habakkuk and the New Testament. Centuries after the prophet stood looking toward the crisis of Babylon, Paul would quote his words. In Romans 1:17, Habakkuk's declaration appears as Paul introduces the righteousness of God revealed in the gospel. The righteous shall live by faith. Paul takes a line spoken into the instability of Habakkuk's world and places it within his explanation of the gospel. Human beings do not establish righteousness before God through confidence in themselves. Life comes through faith. In Galatians 3, Paul quotes Habakkuk again while arguing that no one is justified before God by the law. Again, the contrast between human self-reliance and faith becomes central. And the letter to the Hebrews also reaches back to Habakkuk. There, the context returns strongly to endurance. The community addressed in Hebrews must not throw away its confidence. It must endure. The promised one will come. The righteous live by faith. Do not shrink back. That use is especially striking because it preserves something important from Habakkuk's original situation: waiting. Habakkuk was told the vision had an appointed time. Though it seemed to delay, he was to wait. Hebrews takes language from that passage and again places God's people in the position of faithful endurance. The centuries have changed. The immediate crisis has changed, but the spiritual posture remains recognizable. Trust while waiting. Live faithfully before fulfillment becomes visible. Do not interpret delay as defeat. This does not mean Habakkuk understood every way his words would later be used. The prophet spoke first into Judah's historical crisis. We should allow him to speak there before moving forward. But the New Testament itself shows that his words belong to a larger biblical trajectory. What began as an answer to one frightened prophet became part of Scripture's great language of faith. And there is another connection. Habakkuk's story belongs to the larger biblical tension between the kingdoms human beings build and the kingdom of God. Babylon is one of Scripture's great symbols of proud human power. In Habakkuk, Babylon is a literal historical empire. We should not lose that. Its soldiers were real. Its conquests were real. Its victims were real. But later biblical literature can also draw on Babylon as a larger image of arrogant systems opposed to God. By the time we reach Revelation, the name Babylon carries symbolic force far beyond the Neo-Babylonian Empire of Habakkuk's day. The historical empire fell. The human impulse Babylon represented did not. The desire to accumulate without limit, to dominate, to turn economic power into security, to build glory through exploitation, to use other human beings as tools, to trust created things, to make human strength function like a god. Those patterns remain. That is why Habakkuk's 5 woes continue to feel recognizable. The prophet is describing one empire. He is also exposing recurring forms of pride. But we must stop short of turning every modern nation or political rival into Babylon. Habakkuk gives principles for recognizing arrogance and injustice. He does not give us permission to attach prophetic labels carelessly to anyone we dislike. His target was specific. His warning is broader. Power must answer to God. Wealth does not erase guilt. National success does not prove national righteousness. Military victory does not make a cause morally perfect. Religious symbols do not protect a society that abandons justice. And no human system becomes eternal because the people inside it believe it will. These are uncomfortable truths. They were uncomfortable for Judah. They were fatal to Babylon's pride. And they remain uncomfortable anywhere human beings begin treating visible power as ultimate. But Habakkuk is not merely a book about nations. It is ultimately a book about where one person stands when nations shake. That is why the book ends with a prophet rather than an empire. Habakkuk could not control Judah. He could not control Babylon. He could not control the timing of judgment. He could not control harvests. He could not force God to reveal every mystery. But he could decide where his trust would rest. And by the final verses, the answer is clear. Not in circumstances. Not in agricultural abundance. Not in political stability. Not in Judah's military strength. Not in the temple as though a building itself guaranteed protection. Not in his own ability to understand the future. His trust rests in the Lord. That is the meaning of his final joy. It is not denial. It is not emotional manipulation. It is not positive thinking. It is not the belief that faithful people will never experience disaster. Judah's later history would make such an interpretation impossible. Habakkuk's joy is an act of resistance against despair. The fig tree may fail, yet. The vines may be empty, yet. The olive crop may disappear, yet. The fields may give no food, yet. The flock may be cut off, yet. The stalls may be empty, yet. I will rejoice in the Lord. Every loss makes that word heavier. Yet, the prophet is not saying loss does not hurt. He is saying loss cannot become Lord. That is the final defeat of Babylon inside Habakkuk, before Babylon itself is ever defeated historically. Babylon's worldview says visible strength determines reality. Habakkuk refuses. Babylon's worldview says possession determines security. Habakkuk refuses. Babylon's worldview says prosperity proves greatness. Habakkuk refuses. Babylon's worldview says power deserves worship. Habakkuk refuses. His circumstance may be devastated by the empire, but the empire cannot force him to believe the empire's theology. That is why his faith is stronger at the end than it was at the beginning. The man who started by asking why God had not changed the world becomes a man whose trust no longer depends on the world changing first. This does not mean believers should stop asking for justice. Habakkuk never becomes indifferent. His book exists because he cared. It does not mean suffering people should be told simply to stop questioning. God allowed Habakkuk's questions into Scripture. It does not mean every tragedy should be explained by claiming we know precisely what God is doing behind it. Habakkuk received specific prophetic revelation about Babylon. We usually do not. There is humility required here. We should not claim knowledge God has not given. But Habakkuk does show what can be known, even when much remains unknown. God is holy. Evil matters. Human beings are accountable. Pride does not endure forever. The righteous are called to faithfulness. God's purposes exceed the present moment, and worship can survive the absence of explanations. That may be the deepest answer the book offers to the problem of evil. Habakkuk asks for an explanation of history. God gives him a revelation of himself within history. The prophet wanted to know why certain events were happening. He received enough understanding to see that neither Judah's sin nor Babylon's power had escaped God's attention. But ultimately, Habakkuk's peace comes not because every why has been solved. It comes because the one to whom he directs the why has become enough. This is an important distinction. Some questions can be answered with facts. Others eventually reach the limits of human perspective. Habakkuk reaches those limits. He cannot stand outside time and see every consequence. He cannot know every human heart. He cannot trace every purpose. He cannot see the end from the beginning. So he learns the difference between knowing everything and knowing whom to trust. That is not intellectual surrender. Habakkuk has used his mind throughout the book. He has reasoned. He has challenged. He has compared what he sees with what he knows about God's character. His final faith does not require him to stop thinking. It requires him to recognize the limits of what his thinking can control. He can ask. He can listen. He can remember. He can wait. And when he reaches the boundary of his understanding, he can still worship. That is mature faith, not a faith with no questions, a faith the questions cannot finally destroy. And now we can see why Habakkuk's 3 chapters move so carefully through their different stages. Chapter 1 gives us the crisis. Why does evil continue? Why Babylon? Chapter 2 gives us the vision. Wait, pride will not endure. The righteous will live by faith. Woe to the oppressor. The earth belongs ultimately to God's glory. The Lord is in his holy temple. Chapter 3 gives us the transformed prophet. Remember your works. In wrath remember mercy. I tremble, yet I will rejoice. The structure itself tells the story. Complaint, revelation, worship. Not because complaint is forbidden, because complaint is not meant to be the final destination. Habakkuk brings his confusion into God's presence and stays there long enough to be changed. That may be one of the most useful lessons from his life. There is a difference between bringing questions to God and using questions as a reason never to listen. Habakkuk does the first. He speaks honestly. Then he stands at the watchtower. He waits to hear. When the answer challenges him, he does not flee. When he discovers that Judah is guilty, he accepts it. When he discovers Babylon will be used, he struggles. When he learns Babylon will also be judged, he listens. When told to wait, he waits. When the vision reveals God's holiness, he worships. His faith survives because it remains in relationship. And that allows us to return one last time to the title of his story. From doubt to unshakable faith. Habakkuk's doubt was not the absence of belief. It was the pain of a believer whose understanding could not yet hold everything he saw. His faith becomes unshakable, not because his mind receives every possible answer. It becomes unshakable because its foundation changes. At first, if God is just, why do I see this? At the end, even if I see devastation, the Lord remains my strength. The prophet moves from demanding that circumstances confirm God's character to trusting God's character when circumstances do not. That is the turning point, and it leads to one final correction of how we often think about faith. Unshakable faith does not mean an unshaking person. Habakkuk shook. He said his body trembled, his lips quivered, weakness entered his bones. He knew fear. Unshakable faith means that beneath the shaking person, there is a foundation the shaking cannot remove. Habakkuk trembles, yet he waits. He fears, yet he remembers. He anticipates loss, yet he rejoices. His emotional state changes, his God does not. That is why the final declaration is so powerful. The Lord God is my strength. At the beginning, Habakkuk was asking where God was. At the end, God has become the ground beneath his feet. And from there, the imagery rises. He makes my feet like the deer. He makes me tread on the heights. Habakkuk does not say God makes every road level. He says God gives him footing. The height remains. The difficult terrain remains, but the prophet can stand there now. This is not a promise that every believer will escape hardship. It is a testimony that hardship does not have to possess the final word over faith. The world Habakkuk knew was approaching upheaval. Babylon would come. Judah would suffer. Jerusalem would eventually fall. But the covenant story would not end in Babylon. The exiles would not disappear from history. The scriptures would continue. Jerusalem would be rebuilt. Generations would wait, and in the fullness of the biblical story, the question of righteousness by faith would be taken up again as the gospel was proclaimed. Habakkuk could not see all of that from his watchtower. He did not need to. He needed enough light to remain faithful in his generation. And perhaps this is why the watchtower is such a fitting image for the entire book. The watchman cannot see the whole world. He sees farther than those below him, but even he sees only the horizon. Faith does not turn him into God. It teaches him to trust the God beyond the horizon. Habakkuk's story therefore ends without pretending the horizon has disappeared. There are still things he cannot see, but now he knows how to stand while waiting for them. So when we ask, why does God allow evil? Habakkuk does not answer with one sentence. He gives us a journey. He tells us evil should grieve us. Bring the grief to God. He tells us apparent silence does not prove absence. Wait. He tells us God's methods may disturb our assumptions. Keep listening. He tells us power can become idolatry. Do not worship what appears unstoppable. He tells us injustice has an appointed end. Do not confuse delay with permanence. He tells us human pride is temporary. Do not build your life on it. He tells us judgment is real. Ask for mercy. He tells us fear can remain even inside faith. Do not confuse trembling with abandonment. And finally, he tells us that when everything visible fails, God can still be enough. Rejoice in him. Habakkuk began with a nation full of noise, violence, strife, arguments, the advance of armies, the boasting of an empire, the cries of the oppressed. He reaches a moment in chapter 2 when all that noise is interrupted. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Then chapter 3 gives us the response to that silence. Not emptiness, worship. The man who once could not understand God's silence has discovered that sometimes silence before God is exactly where faith learns to speak correctly. And what does that faith finally say? Not, I understand everything. Not, nothing will hurt. Not, Babylon is harmless. Not, the harvest will certainly return tomorrow. It says, yet I will rejoice. That is Habakkuk's answer. Not an answer that makes evil small. An answer that makes God greater. Not an answer that removes history. An answer that gives the believers somewhere to stand within it. Not an answer that promises the righteous will never tremble. An answer that shows trembling does not have to become surrender. The prophet's questions were real. The judgment was real. Babylon was real. The empty fields were possible, but none of them was ultimate. Habakkuk's journey began with the terrifying possibility that God had forgotten to act. It ends with the recognition that God had never stopped ruling. The prophet could not see every movement. He could finally trust the one directing the story. And that is why a book written in the shadow of a rising empire remains alive long after that empire has disappeared. Babylon became ruins. Habakkuk's confession endured. Empires still rise, people still suffer, believers still ask, how long? And across the centuries, the prophet's final testimony still answers from the edge of an empty field. The harvest may fail, the world may shake, the explanation may wait, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Habakkuk never received a life without uncertainty. He received something stronger, a faith that could survive it.